Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right, cool. All right, so we go through in the homework. With definitions, do we feel okay with all of these, or is there anything we want to go over?
No, we're good.
Okay.
Okay. All right, cool. Okay, so the next one, so we'll go over this diagram here. So we're looking at this first diagram. It says label the following structures of these blood vessels. And so D, E, and F refer to the types of blood vessels we're looking at. Okay. So we're starting with A. What part of the blood vessel does A refer to?
So it's a tunica intima, the most inner layer part.
Yes.
Right, the tunica intima or the tunica interna. Yeah. Both the same
Interna,
thing.
yeah.
The intimate
Yeah, so that's
tunica.
the right. And so that's the innermost layer. That's the part that's actually going to be making contact with the blood. So the second one, B, is what?
Tunica
Yeah.
media.
Media.
The tunica media. Cool. And so what's the tunica media made out of?
Smooth muscle.
Smooth muscle. Right. Exactly.
Connective tissue.
And some elastic tissue, but mostly smooth muscle here. Yeah. Perfect. Cool. And number C, or letter C?
Tunica.
Tunica externa.
The tunica externa. Perfect. All right. What about D? What kind of blood vessel are we looking at here?
The lumen. The lumen of the artery.
So yeah, so this would be an artery.
So that's an artery, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I
Yeah, so this would be an artery. Cool. And then what's E?
E is the capillary.
Capillaries.
E is the capillary. Perfect. And then F.
What was that?
What are we looking at with F?
I have
F is the vein.
the vein.
F is a vein. Right. Cool. And then G?
I have
It's a valve.
Oh no, I
Valve.
missed G completely. I didn't even write G. Oh,
It's a valve.
Oh, don't worry about it.
God. I completely missed it.
No worries, no worries, no worries. Cool. So we got D, which is an artery, then E, which is a capillary, and then F, which is a vein. Okay. So how do we know that we're looking? How do we know that D is an artery and not a vein? How are we able to distinguish between a vein and an artery?
because the
valve.
the lumen.
Lumen,
It's a
the
valve.
valve.
All right. So we got the valve.
Uh-huh.
All right. So so the valve is going to be in a vein. Okay. Then I heard a lumen as well.
The lumen as well,
Right.
yes.
So
It's the
yeah. So which one has a bigger lumen?
The vein. The vein
vein.
has a bigger.
The vein.
Yes.
Right. The vein has a bigger lumen. Perfect. Yeah, and then there's another way that we can tell which one we're looking at as well.
Is it
Anyone have an
the
idea?
tunica media as well? Because the veins has a lot smaller tunica media, the smooth muscle, compared to the artery.
Right. So an artery is going to have a much thicker tunica media than a vein will. Okay. And so because the artery has a thicker tunica media, it's going to be better able to expand and contract rather than the vein, which can't really do that as well. Cool. Okay. Actually, one other thing I wanted to mention. So this was something that kind of a lot of people missed on the labs. When we're looking at a systemic vein and a systemic artery, which one carries blood away from the heart?
Systemic vein.
Vein.
Oh, from the heart is the systemic artery.
It's the artery that takes
A systemic artery.
Yeah.
Wait, away.
Right.
vein.
So systemic artery. Exactly. So a systemic artery will always carry blood away from the heart.
Yes.
Okay? And a systemic vein will always carry blood towards the heart. Okay? So arteries will always carry blood away. Veins will always carry blood towards. Now, again, if we're looking at a systemic vein versus this systemic artery, which one carries oxygenated blood?
The vein.
The artery, right?
Systemic vein.
The
So
arteries.
if it's away from the heart. So if it's away from the heart, then.
So systemic arteries will always carry oxygenated blood. Yeah, so this is one that a lot of people missed on the lab. So systemic arteries are coming from the left ventricle. Okay. And so when they come from the left ventricle, they're going to be transporting oxygenated blood throughout the rest of the body systems. Okay. Now, pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins will do the opposite. Okay. So pulmonary veins will always carry oxygenated blood, while pulmonary arteries will always carry deoxygenated blood. Okay, but systemic arteries carry oxygenated blood. Systemic veins will carry deoxygenated blood.
Oh my God, can you repeat
Does that
that?
make sense, or do we kind of need to go through that one more time?
Yeah.
Can you repeat that again?
Yeah, so let me kind of draw this out real quick.
Yeah.
So let me take our, so I'll kind of draw a heart here. Okay, let's just say this is our heart, right? Okay, we have 4 chambers. Okay, I'm gonna draw some lungs up here. Let me do this in another color. Put our lungs in purple. I'll just kind of put, okay, those are our lungs. Okay, again, sorry, bad drawing, but bear with me. So when we're taking blood from the pulmonary arteries, sorry, from the, yeah, so we're going from the heart to the lungs. We're going to be going through the pulmonary arteries, right? And so that is going to be carrying deoxygenated blood because it's coming from the right ventricle. Okay. So I'll just put PA for pulmonary arteries. Okay. So this is going to be deoxygenated blood. Okay. Now, when the blood reaches the lungs, it's going to get oxygenated. And so now we're going to be returning back to the left atrium through the pulmonary veins. Okay. So pulmonary veins will always carry oxygenated blood, okay, from the lungs back to the heart. Okay. Follow me so far?
Yes.
Okay. So then from there, when this blood leaves comes to the left atrium, goes to the left ventricle, then it's going to be leaving through systemic arteries. So systemic arteries go to the rest of your body systems. Okay, I'll just kind of put this in brown here. Okay. So I'll just put the rest of your systems in brown. Okay. And so these would be going through the systemic arteries.
Which is oxy blood, right?
Right, which is oxygenated blood.
Yeah.
Okay. Once the oxygenated blood goes to the rest of your body tissues, you're going to be delivering oxygen and then picking up carbon dioxide. Okay. And then that blood is eventually going to become deoxygenated and it's going to return back to the heart in the right atrium, okay, through the systemic veins. Okay. So here we see, depending on where our veins are, whether we're looking at pulmonary veins or systemic veins, there's going to be a difference between oxygenation of the blood. Okay. And then the same thing with arteries. Okay. So pulmonary arteries will always carry deoxygenated blood to the lungs, whereas systemic arteries will always carry oxygenated blood to the rest of your body tissues. Pulmonary veins will carry oxygenated blood from the lungs, while systemic veins will carry deoxygenated blood to your heart. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think.
And the blood gets cleaned up through the capillary system, right?
Yeah, so the blood is going to be kind of be exchanging that oxygen and carbon dioxide through the capillaries.
Okay.
I think I saw this in the blood circulation slide.
Yes.
Yes, yeah, I know.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions here?
Can you? No.
Okay. So again, this is one thing that's really important to make sure you got straight for the exam, because this is going to be something that's going to be really important in terms of oxygenation and knowing where oxygenated blood is going to be coming from and where deoxygenated blood is going to be coming from. Okay. Okay. So any last minute questions before we go through this? Because again, this was one thing that a lot of people missed on the labs from last week.
No.
Last minute questions. Okay. So if not, we'll go ahead and move forward here. Okay, so then now, question 7. So here we're looking at the heart. Okay, so we're going to look at all these different parts of the heart. So if we're looking at number 1, what vessel is number 1?
Inferior vena.
Inferior vena cava. The
Right,
inferior.
the inferior vena cava. Then number 2.
This is
Superior
superior one.
vena cava.
The superior vena cava. Then 3.
The right atrium.
Right atrium.
Right atrium. Cool. 4.
Tricuspid valve.
Valve.
Yes, this would be the tricuspid valve. So remember, the tricuspid valve is in between the right atrium and the next one, which is number 5, the what?
Right ventricle.
Right ventricle.
The right ventricle. Right, perfect. So the tricuspid valve is always between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Okay, then number 6, what do we have here? Which valve?
The pulmonary.
Pulmonary.
Right, the pulmonary valve.
Mm.
And then number 7?
The pulmonary.
Pulmonary trunk.
Trunk.
Pulmonary trunk. Yep. And then number 8?
The right and
Pulmonary
Pulmonary artery.
arteries.
Pulmonary arteries. Cool. And then number 9?
We have
Pulmonary vein.
veins.
pulmonary veins.
Right. Those are our pulmonary veins. And remember those, so those are going to be those are going to be oxygenated blood, and while the pulmonary arteries are going to be deoxygenated blood. Okay. Then the pulmonary veins will open up into number 10, which is the what?
Left atrium.
Left atrium.
The left atrium. Cool. Then we have number 11, which is the
Mitral valve. The bicuspid.
the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve, right? And then number 12,
Left ventricle.
the left ventricle. Number 13,
Aortic valve.
valve.
the aortic valve. Okay. Then 14,
Ascending aorta.
yeah, so ascending aorta, or if you just put aorta, that's fine too. And then number 15, which is a branch off of the aorta. Which branch is this here?
Brachiocephalic trunk.
Brachiocephalic trunk.
The brachiocephalic trunk. Perfect. Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, any questions on the parts of this heart here? Okay. All right, so now moving forward here. So number 8, so the abdominal aorta divides into the right and left blank arteries. What are we looking at there?
Is it the iliac?
Common iliac.
Yeah, iliac. Common iliac.
Right.
Yeah.
The left and right common iliac arteries. Perfect. Cool. Number 9, so the blank valve prevents backflow of blood into the left ventricle.
Aortic.
Aortic.
What do we think here? The aortic valve, right? So the aortic valve is going to prevent blood from flowing back into the left ventricle. Perfect. Number 10, so the blank branch of the left coronary artery is located in the coronary sulcus and supplies the left atrium and the left ventricle.
Circumflex.
Circumflex.
Right, this is the circumflex branch. Perfect. Cool. Number 11, so when infection occurs in the body by a foreign bacteria, the first leukocytes to be recruited to fight the infection are the what?
Neutrophils.
The neutrophils. Right, so the neutrophils are the first responders for any type of bacterial infection. And the last one, number 12, so blank stem cells will eventually develop into lymphocytes and natural killer cells.
Lymphoid.
Lymphoids.
The lymphoid stem cells.
Yes.
Perfect. All right, cool. Any questions on any of these so far? Okay, cool. Number 13. So below is a picture of the heart. So looking at the aortic arch, name the branches of the aorta from left to right from the observer's point of view. Okay. So 1, 2, and 3. What are these 3 vessels here?
Brachiocephalic trunk. The left.
Brachiocephalic trunk. Left common carotid.
And the left subclavian
And then the
artery.
And the left subclavian artery. Perfect. Right, so we got the brachiocephalic trunk, left common carotid, and then the left subclavian arteries. All right, cool. Number 14. So if a coronary artery is completely obstructed by plaque, what will happen? So at A, cardiac tissue distal to the blockage will die due to lack of oxygen. B, blood flow will eventually break up the plaque, restoring blood flow through the coronary arteries. C, the heart will be just fine and continue to function normally. Or D, multiple organ systems will fail as a result of not getting enough blood flow.
A, cardiac tissue distal to the blockage will die due to the lack of oxygen.
Exactly. Right. So when there's a blockage in a coronary artery, and no blood is going to be able to get through. Okay. If no blood is able to get past that blockage, anything that's distal to that particular blockage won't have any access to oxygen. And as a result, that tissue is going to end up dying and developing into scar tissue. Okay. Any questions on this one here?
No.
Okay. Well, number 15. So the layers of the artery wall that are responsible for vasoconstriction and vasodilation are the what? Tunica media, tunica externa, tunica interna, or all of the above?
Tunica
Tunica media.
Tunica media, right. And why is that?
because that's where it opens to dilate and closes to constrict. That's where the muscle is, right?
Yes, that's the key. That's what I was looking for. So that's where the smooth muscle is.
Smooth.
Right. So because there's smooth muscle there, that muscle is going to be able to contract and relax. And as it does that, it's going to cause vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Perfect. Okay. Number 16. So Brittany has been in a car accident and lost a lot of blood. After arriving to the ER, you, as the attending physician, decides she needs a blood transfusion now. You discover that, oh, I messed up the names here. This is supposed to be Brittany. You discover that Brittany has type AB blood. So which of the following blood types can she receive? So we got type A, B, AB, O, all of them, or none of them, if they have
All of
type
them.
AB blood.
All of these,
All of them, right. And why is that?
because its antigen is AB, but its antibody is, it has no antibodies, right?
Exactly, right. So she has both the A and the B antigen, okay? And so she's not going to be producing the antibodies. So she's not going to produce any anti-A antibodies or anti-B antibodies. Okay? So because she's not producing any antibodies, she's going to be able to receive any blood type because she's not going to have anything to react against any incoming blood. Right, so she'll be able to receive all of those blood types.
And that would be the
Any questions? Yeah.
Is that the universal recipient?
Yes. Yes.
This would be the universal recipient, assuming she was AB positive. I kind of simplified it in this question here. But if she was AB positive, then yes, she would be the universal recipient. Cool. Any questions here in terms of the antigens and antibodies and things like that?
No.
So if you receive a question like this, that is just AB and no positive or negative, are you supposed to assume that it's positive?
Yeah, so if I give you just the AB, I don't say positive or negative, then just don't worry about the positive or negative, okay? Just worry about the A and the B.
Okay.
Yeah, so just ignore it altogether. So yeah, so I'll just leave it at that. There is a question on the exam that has to do with blood transfusion. So make sure that you feel comfortable with this, including the RH factor, okay? Determining whether it's going to be RH positive or RH negative, and what types of blood transfusions you can do with that. Was everyone able to see the video that I posted on Friday about blood transfusions?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So that's up on Canvas under the Chapter 12 module. If you are still not comfortable with it, go to that video, do a bunch of examples so you can kind of work through some of those examples there too. Okay, that's number 16. Number 17, so Johnny is experiencing backflow of blood or regurgitation into his right atrium. Which valve is most likely defective? Tricuspid, bicuspid, aortic, or pulmonary valve?
Tricuspid.
The tricuspid valve, right. So the tricuspid valve is normally supposed to allow blood to run from the right atrium to the right ventricle. If it's defective, okay, it's not going to be closing properly, and so blood is going to end up flowing back into the right atrium. Okay, so that's the tricuspid valve. All right, number 18. So name one organ or muscle, or group of muscles that each of the following blood vessels supplies or drains. Okay. So if we're looking at the internal jugular vein, what's one thing that the internal jugular vein will either supply or drain?
I have the brain, meninges, the bones of the cranial muscle of the face and neck.
Right. So the brain, meninges, and then bones of the cranium. Okay. So exactly. So is this going to be supplying blood, or is this going to be draining blood from somewhere?
Draining.
Draining. Yeah.
Draining. Right. So it's going to be draining from the brain, the meninges, and the bones of the cranium. Perfect. Cool. What about B, the coronary sinus? Let's start with, is it going to be supplying or draining?
Emptying, right? Draining.
Right. It's going to be draining deoxygenated blood. And where is it going to be draining that blood from?
The coronary veins.
Yeah.
The coronary veins, right. So it's going to be draining essentially from the myocardium. Yeah. And so all the coronary veins are going to empty into the coronary sinus, which will then drop off into the right atrium. If you said coronary veins, I'll take that too. Okay, so letter C, we have the left subclavian artery. So what is the left subclavian artery going to be supplying or draining? Well, let's start, is it going to be supplying or draining?
Supplying.
It's going to be supplying to the muscles of the left arm.
Right. So it's going to be supplying muscles of the left arm. Perfect. Cool. So it's going to be supplying oxygen and nutrients to the left arm. D, the femoral artery. Supplying or draining? Supplying.
Supplying.
Okay, good. And what is it going to be supplying?
Muscles of the
Supplying
side.
blood to lower extremities.
Muscle.
Yeah.
Right, the muscles of the leg. Right, so the thigh, the hamstrings, the quadriceps, the
Vastus
knee to some degree.
medialis.
Femur,
Exactly.
tendons.
Exactly. Perfect. And then the last one, the great saphenous vein, is supplying or draining?
Draining.
Draining. Perfect. Okay. And so is it going to be, what's it going to be draining?
The integumentary tissue, so I guess the skin, right?
Yep, the skin of the what?
Superficial muscles of the lower limbs.
Yes.
Okay.
So skin of the superficial leg, the muscles of the leg, and so on and so forth. So anything really in the lower leg is going to be drained by the great saphenous vein. Perfect. Okay. Any questions on this one here?
No.
No.
Okay. Cool. All right. So number 19. So answer both questions. So A, starting with that one. Describe the three main functions of blood. Okay. So someone give me one function.
Transportation.
What'd you say?
Transportation.
Transportation. Right. So transportation of what? What are we going to be transporting?
It transports oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
And
Nutrients.
blood cells.
Okay. Uh-huh. Yeah, so it's going to be transporting oxygen, it's going to be transporting blood cells, hormones,
Oh, that's right.
carbon dioxide, nutrients. Yeah, so all these things are going to be transported in blood. Okay. What's another function?
Regulation. So
Okay.
it regulates
Regulation.
the pH, the body temperature, and the water content.
Exactly. So it's going to be regulating your pH, your body temperature, and then water. I'll even put water and salt content.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay. And then 3, what's the last function?
Protection.
Protection.
All right, so protection how?
Protection against diseases.
That like if you
Right, so
have,
protection against disease.
yeah, if you have an injury, white blood cells will rush to the site so you don't bleed out.
Right. Well, I think you're confusing a couple of things. So white blood cells, they're going to be fighting against diseases specifically, but preventing from bleeding out
Yeah.
is going to be done by what type of cells?
Blood clotting.
That's by plasma, by the
Platelets.
platelets. Yes.
The platelets. Right. So platelets are going to be protecting you from bleeding out, okay? And so they're going to help form blood clots, while white blood cells are going to be involved with protecting you from diseases and infections and things like that. Cool. All right, good. And then B, so why is the lifespan of a red blood cell so short? Anyone have an idea for this one?
Yeah, because
Oh,
go ahead.
you go, Priscilla.
Go ahead.
No, you go.
Okay, because they take a beating when they try to fit through the capillaries.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they have to squeeze through the capillaries, and then after a while, they're like really beat up from doing that over time. So they eventually will burst.
Exactly. So they're going to incur a lot of damage as they kind of scrape against the insides of the capillaries, right? Problem is they can't repair themselves, right? So they don't. Why can't they repair themselves?
Oh, because they
Because
don't
they
have
don't have organelles.
Right. They don't have any organelles, so they're not going to have a nucleus. They don't have any mitochondria. Okay? They don't have any ATP necessary to help them do stuff, and they don't have any organelles to help kind of repair and replace things. Okay? So whatever damage they get, that's just kind of damage they're going to kind of continue to develop, and they have no way of repairing themselves. Cool. All right, good. And then last question. So describe the blood flow beginning in the right atrium and ending in the vena cava.
Oh my gosh.
Go, Priscilla.
So this is a bit of a long one, so we'll kind of go through it. So starting in the right atrium.
So in the right,
Once blood flows through the right atrium, where is it going to go through first? And we're going to include all the valves in the different blood vessels.
well, it
Which
flows,
valve?
it flows in from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava at the seem like the same time through the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve, and it like rushes through into the right ventricle, and then it goes up through the pulmonary valve, and it goes into the brachiocephalic trunk.
Okay, so that's different. So
The pulmonary
remember, the
trunk?
brachiocephalic trunk is part, right, the pulmonary trunk.
Yeah, pulmonary trunk.
Yes.
And then
Okay, so then once we get to the pulmonary trunk, where are we going now?
The left atrium.
Not yet.
we go to the
So
capillary.
after the pulmonary trunk,
Yeah.
where did the
The
pulmonary
right
trunk
and
will
left
divide into the
pulmonary.
what?
Right and left arteries.
Right, the pulmonary arteries. Okay. Then once they go through the pulmonary arteries, then they're going to hit the what?
The capillaries, right, to get cleaned up.
The pulmonary capillaries, yes. And so the pulmonary capillaries inside the lung. And so what's going to happen, before we go forward here, what's going to happen inside the pulmonary capillaries?
You're going to exhale to get rid of carbon dioxide and inhale to pick up oxygenated rich blood, the oxygen, clean blood for the systemic.
Yeah, so the so what's going to happen here is the pulmonary arteries, which will have lots of carbon dioxide in it, they're going to start depositing carbon dioxide into the lungs, and then they're going to start picking up oxygen, right? Which is oxygen that we just breathed in. Okay. So then once we exit out of the pulmonary capillaries, where do we go now?
The left atrium.
Before we get to the left atrium, which vessels?
Pulmonary vein.
The pulmonary veins, right?
Oh, yeah.
And then from the pulmonary veins, then we reach the left atrium.
Through the mitral valve.
Through the
Right.
mitral valve or the bicuspid valve. Yep. And then from the bicuspid valve into the what?
Left ventricle.
To the
Left ventricle. Okay. Then from the left ventricle, we go into the what?
Aortic valve.
the
Aortic valve.
aortic
Valve, yes.
Aortic valve.
Ascending aorta to the aorta.
aorta.
To the
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and just put aorta.
common
And then
carotid.
from the aorta. So once the blood gets into the aorta, it can either enter the brachiocephalic trunk, it can enter the left common carotid, or it can enter the left subclavian. I'll just say, for the sake of simplifying this, we'll just say it's going to go through the rest of your body systems. I'll just put systemic arteries. Then from the systemic arteries, it's going to reach the
all the
what?
organs, all the organ system in the body.
Right, it's going to reach all the organ systems, and it's going to do that through the systemic capillaries, right? So I'll just put tissues over here. Okay. And then from systemic capillaries, we enter what?
We enter, I think the vena cava.
Oh, yes.
Before the vena cava.
Yeah.
The counterpart to the systemic arteries are the what?
Say that again?
Systemic veins.
Systemic veins, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So with the systemic veins, and then from there, we'll enter the vena cava. Either the inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, or the coronary sinus, depending on where we are in the body. Right. And then that will direct us right back into the right atrium where we started.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So you should be able to trace this whole pathway from memory for the exam. Okay. So what helps us to kind of draw out the heart and try to trace the pathway over and over and over until you can do it from memory. Okay. Okay. Any questions on the homework?
Is it safe to, because I get tricked up on the pulmonary veins on that pathway, is it safe to think of it that the veins have blood away from the heart, right? And arteries toward the heart? I think you mentioned that a couple times on the last lecture.
No, so arteries will always go away from the heart,
Yeah.
and veins will always bring blood back towards the heart. Okay. Regardless of whether you're looking at the systemic or the pulmonary veins. So here we're looking at the systemic veins over here.
Yeah.
So veins will always go back to the heart. Pulmonary veins will always go back to the heart. Okay. They're just coming from different places, and they have different oxygen levels. Okay. Same thing with arteries. So arteries will always go away from the heart. Whether you're looking at the pulmonary arteries, and systemic arteries are always going to go away from the heart as well. Okay. But again, the difference is the oxygenation levels.
Okay.
I think you can even trace it through this circulation system. You can trace it through what we just did right now.
Okay.
Yes.
Priscilla.
Yeah. So you want to be able to trace this from what we just did. Okay, working from one chamber and working all the way back to that chamber. Okay. And like I said, this will be up on the exam too. This one will be a free response question. So make sure that you feel comfortable with this. Okay. All right. Any other questions here? Okay. All right. If not, we will go ahead and take a look at our lecture for today. And so today we're going to be taking a look at the respiratory system. Is everyone able to see the PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, so we're going to be taking a look at the respiratory system. Oh, actually, before we go forward, so a couple quick things. So number one, there is a very short homework assignment for chapter 23, which is the respiratory system, and that will be due on Wednesday by 5 o'clock. Again, very short. I think it was kind of the same situation as the one last time before the exam. So very short. Make sure that one's done by Wednesday. And so that'll give you an idea of what kind of questions to be comfortable with regarding the respiratory system for exam 3. Okay. Exam 3 will be this Wednesday. Same kind of style as last time. I'll open it up at 8 o'clock in the morning. It'll be closed at 11:59 p.m. So you have all day to take it. You can take it anytime during that window. Just make sure you complete it by 11:59. Same format. It'll be same number of questions. I think there might be one less extra credit question just because of the fact that you're taking it online. But yeah, so that'll be on Wednesday. There's a lab for respiratory system, which will be which is up on Canvas already, as well as the homework. So that needs to be done by Wednesday at 11:59. So try to get it done as soon as you can. And then if you haven't already looked at the blood transfusion video, that one is up on Canvas as well. Okay. Okay. Any questions on anything that's coming up?
Is there a lecture on Wednesday or is it just the exam?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's just exam.
So there won't be any lecture on Wednesday. I will have office hours, probably from 4 to 5. So if there's anything that any questions that you have before you take the exam, I'll be up on Zoom for office hours if you have any questions. But other than that, there won't be a lecture on Wednesday. So you just take the exam, and then you just run through spring break, not having to worry about any anatomy. Cool.
For the next exam, were you planning to give a study guide during spring break, or?
For exam 4?
Yeah.
Yeah. So exam 4, I will put up a study guide for that after this upcoming exam.
Okay. Thank you.
So yeah. So if I forget to upload it before spring break, let me know, and I'll make sure to upload it.
Okay. Thank you.
Um,
Just in case anyone.
So Nadine's question says there's no lecture at all next week. So yeah. So for spring break, next week we have spring break, no lecture at all. So don't worry about Zoom or anything like that, because I won't be worrying about it either.
George, everything that's due on Wednesday is due at 11:59, right?
The lab will be, the lab and the exam will both be
The
done.
lab and exam. And what about the homework? Was that 5?
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be 5, just like normal.
5, okay. Perfect.
Any other questions?
No.
So Elizabeth was asking if I'll do a review session for Wednesday's exam. I think, how do we feel about doing a review session for Wednesday's exam? Actually, I think what we'll do is we'll just not have a review session. Actually, what do you guys think? What do you guys think? What do you guys want to do
I think
in terms of having a review session?
It would have to be today, wouldn't it?
It would have to be today.
I'm okay without it, but I don't speak for everyone, so.
I'm okay without it too. So.
Okay.
I'm okay either way. I did notice the study guide was a little bit different from the other ones. I don't know if it was the processes of everything. It just seemed a little bit challenging. I'm okay either way.
Okay, so then I guess what we'll do then is we'll go through our lecture just like normal. I'll stay on for an hour longer after lecture. If anyone has any questions, I'll be here to answer any questions and try to help review. If not, you can just end just kind of leave, and then you're good to go for Wednesday.
Okay.
So let's do that.
Okay.
And then Erica, so homework will be due on Wednesday, not Thursday. Okay. Any other questions?
Oh, sorry.
Uh-oh.
Alrighty, so, and then again, for blood transfusion, there's a video up on Canvas already. So if you have any questions, or if you want to get a little bit of extra practice with blood transfusion and which ones are compatible, which ones are not, there's a video up on Canvas on chapter 12. And so you can kind of use that to help you kind of clarify everything. Cool. Okay, so with that, we're going to go ahead and dive into the respiratory system. And so the respiratory system is going to be a really important system that kind of goes hand in hand with the cardiovascular system. Okay, so what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be looking at the anatomy of the respiratory system, essentially from the nose all the way down into the lungs, and look at all the different components and structures that we're able to see there. So we're going to go from the nose, we're going to look at the pharynx and the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi. We're going to be looking at the lungs, and then we're going to look at how we're able to move oxygen over the course of our inhalation and exhalation processes, okay, and how we're able to respire. And then at the end, we're going to take a look at we're going to be looking at how the brain is going to be involved with regulating our respiration as well. All right, so that's the game plan. So the respiratory system is a very, very important system, and it goes hand in hand with the cardiovascular system, which is why I kind of lumped it into this unit. The cardiovascular system cannot work without the lungs and without the respiratory system also working, okay, because the lungs are going to be involved with gas exchange. Okay? They're going to be involved with distributing oxygen into the lungs. So now your lungs are able to now have oxygenated blood that can then go throughout the rest of our system. Okay? So the main goal of the respiratory system is with gas exchange. So in addition to gas exchange, the respiratory system can also do a few other things. It's going to be important to help regulate your blood pH. it's going to help to regulate your sense of smell, because it's going to have certain receptors called olfactory receptors, which we'll take a small little look at later on in the semester. There's going to be the ability to filter any air that comes in. And so when we're breathing in, we're not just breathing in air, we're breathing in a lot of like other stuff we don't want, like ash, debris, pollen, bacteria. So the respiratory system is going to be involved with helping to filter all that stuff out and then make sure we're able to get that out of our bodies. And it's also going to be able to help us produce different sounds and be able to give us, you know, our voice, be able to give us the ability to make all kinds of different sounds for communication. And then the last thing is it's going to be able to get rid of water and heat, okay, to a small degree. Okay. So the study of otorhinolaryngology is the study of the ear, nose, and throat. And so they're going to be able to look at how the ears, nose, and throat are going to be connected and how they're going to be involved with an individual's health. Okay. And then a scientist who studies the lungs is called a pulmonologist. So we're going to be taking a look at both of those sciences kind of in a little bit of detail, you know, as we go through our lecture today. Okay. So when we're looking at the respiratory system, we can divide that into looking at it more structurally in terms of its anatomy, or we can look at it more physiologically in terms of its function. Okay. And so it's going to be divided up into different regions or different certain components depending on which type of the way you're looking at it. Okay. So if we're looking at it from a structural standpoint, we can divide it into the upper respiratory system and the lower respiratory system. Okay. And so the upper respiratory system is going to be made up of the nose, the nasal cavity, and the pharynx. Okay, essentially everything from your throat up. Okay. The lower respiratory system is going to be made up of everything from your throat down. And so that is going to be where we have our larynx, which is our voice box, the trachea, which is the windpipe, and then the bronchi and the lungs. Okay. So those will all make up the lower respiratory system, okay, down here. Okay. Now, if we're looking at it more functionally, okay, we can look at it in terms of what those particular parts are going to be doing. Okay. The first zone is going to be called the conducting zone. And so the main function of the conducting zone is to just move air from the outside of the body into the lungs. Okay. There's no gas exchange really happening here. It's just moving air from point A to point B. Okay. So it's going to be involved with conducting air, and it's also going to help with filtering some of that air, warming the air, and then moistening the air as well. Okay. Then once we start to get into the lungs, that's where we start to encounter our respiratory zone. Okay. And so the respiratory zone is where we're going to have gas exchange actually take place. Okay. This is where we're going to be exchanging oxygen for carbon dioxide inside the body. So we're going to be taking a look at the entirety of the respiratory system. And so this is it here. This is a kind of the lower respiratory system. So as we can see, we're looking at the lungs over here. We're able to see the trachea, and then the larynx, which is up here, and then we can't see the upper respiratory system. Okay, so we're going to start by taking a look at the nose, which is the first part of the respiratory system, and probably the most important part, because if you can't get any air in, there's no gas exchange going to be able to take place. Okay. And so the nose is going to be divided up into an external region and then an internal region. Okay. The external region is made up of a lot of skin, a lot of muscle, some bone, and some cartilage. Okay. And so the bone and cartilage are going to help to form the nostrils, okay, which we'll take a look at in a second here. And so when we take a look at the nose, it's going to be surrounded by two bones. Okay. Inferiorly, it's going to be boarded up by the maxilla bones, okay? And then superiorly, we're going to have the nasal bones. Okay? And so those are going to kind of form the boundaries for our nose. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some of the cartilage that's going to help to make up the nose, and this cartilage is going to be important to help give our nose some structure. Okay? The first part of cartilage is called the septal cartilage. And that's the cartilage that runs right along the ridge of your nose, right here. Okay. And so that septal cartilage is going to start to dive posteriorly into the interior portions of your nose. Okay. And it's going to join up with the nasal septum. Okay. And so when it joins with the nasal septum, that's going to help to separate your nose into the left and right sides, with left and right chambers. So that septal cartilage is going to be connected to the ethmoid bone, or specifically the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, as well as the vomer bone, okay, to help form that septal cartilage. Okay. The next cartilage is called the lateral nasal cartilage. And so that's going to form the lateral aspects of your nose. Okay. And so that lateral nasal cartilage is going to help form the sides of your nose as well as the mid portion of your nose as well. And then the last ones are the major alar cartilage. Okay. And so the major alar cartilage helps to make up the tip of your nose. Okay. And so that is going to form the medial and lateral sides of your nostrils. Okay. And so in order to help us kind of sniff, what's going to happen is the muscles around our nose are going to contract. And when they contract, they're going to allow the cartilage to either constrict or dilate, depending on whether we're kind of inhaling in or exhaling out, out through the nose. Okay. So we have the septal cartilage, the lateral nasal cartilage on the lateral sides of the nose, and then the major alar cartilage, which makes up our kind of the point of our nose and our nostrils. Okay. So then once we start to move through that cartilage, the first region that we're going to reach is the nostrils, which are also called the external nares. Okay. And so the nostrils are going to be these openings that will lead into our nasal cavity. Okay. Okay. And so what's going to happen here is once air starts to flow into the nostrils, it's going to reach a particular region here called the nasal vestibule. Okay. And so inside that nasal vestibule, if you imagine kind of picking your nose, okay, once you kind of insert your fingertip of your fingertip into your nose, you're now inside your nasal vestibule. Okay, and so the nasal vestibule is going to contain lots of hair, which is where you have your nose hair come in. There's going to be some oil glands and some sweat glands, as well as a mucous membrane. Okay, and that mucous membrane is going to provide the mucus that's going to be inside your nose. And in fact, we're going to see mucous membranes throughout the respiratory system, and that's going to really be an important defense mechanism, as we'll see going forward here. Okay, so as we start to move our air from the external nares into the nasal vestibule, eventually it's going to reach this next cavity called the nasal cavity, or also called the internal nose. Okay. And so the nasal cavity is a very large cavity that lies in the anterior parts of the skull. And so this is going to form the majority of your nose. Okay, the majority of your nose is going to be made up by the internal nose. And so the part that we're actually able to see, the visible parts of our nose, are actually a small portion of the nose as a whole. Okay. And so as air starts to enter the nasal cavity, it'll eventually start to move more posteriorly into a region called the pharynx. Okay. And in order to get into the pharynx, it has to pass through this little kind of tunnel or a canal called the internal nares. Okay. So we have the external nares leading into our nasal vestibule, and then we have the internal nares leading into our pharynx, which is our throat. And so inside the nasal cavity is again going to be divided up by the nasal septum, and that's going to divide the nasal cavity into left and right halves. And inside the internal nose, okay, or the nasal cavity, we're going to have two regions. Okay. This inferior region is going to be the larger of the two, and so that is going to be involved with mainly respiration, okay, anything that has to be involved with moving air from point A to point B. Okay. The superior region is the olfactory region, and so this is where we would have all of our smell receptors, okay, that are going to be involved with helping us to pick up on different smells. Okay. All right, any questions so far?
No.
All right. No. Okay. So here's just a larger picture of this whole nasal cavity area. So again, here we have our external nares leading into the nasal vestibule. Here we have a nasal cavity leading into the internal nares. Okay, now when we're in the nasal cavity, okay, there's going to be these two sets of three bony conchi. Okay? And these conchi are basically almost look like shelves coming from the lateral sides of your nasal cavity, okay? From the walls of your nasal cavity. So here we would have one of the superior nasal conchi, the middle nasal conchi, and then the inferior nasal conchi. Okay, and again, they branch from the lateral walls of the nasal cavity here. So they almost look like shelves. They're also called terminates. Okay. So in between all of these conchi, we're going to have these passageways of just air-filled passageways. Okay, we call these the meduses. Okay, so we have a superior meatus, we have a middle meatus, and then an inferior meatus. Okay. These again are just grooves of these passageways formed by the nasal conchae. Now, these conchae are going to play an important role. I'll explain what that role is in a second here. Okay. So when we are inside the nasal cavity, okay, inside the nasal cavity, we're going to have our nasal cavity be coated by a respiratory epithelium. Okay, this respiratory epithelium is going to have lots of capillaries available. And so these capillaries are going to be filled with blood, just like we would see any other place of the body. Okay. So we're going to find some capillaries, and then we're also going to find some ciliated, pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Okay. So the ciliated part is going to be important, and then it's also going to contain some goblet cells. Okay. So these goblet cells are going to be within this epithelium, and if you remember from chapter 3, goblet cells are cells that produce mucus. Okay. So we have some cilia, we have some mucus, and we have some capillaries. Okay. All three of these are going to be important going forward here. Okay. So we'll look at the conchae first. Okay. So the conchae are going to help to increase the surface area inside the nasal cavity. Okay, so because of the way they branch outward from the lateral walls, they increase the surface area, and that's going to be really important because when we breathe out, normally we're breathing out a little bit of water vapor. Okay? What we don't want to have happen is for us to constantly be exhaling water, okay? Because then we're eventually going to dehydrate ourselves. Okay? And so what is able to happen here is because these conchae increase the surface area and there's a lot of goblet cells, these goblet cells are able to absorb some of that water. Okay? So instead of breathing out tons of water, okay, we're going to be able to trap some of that water, a lot of those water droplets inside the respiratory epithelium. Okay? And that prevents our body from dehydrating. Okay? So that's going to be rule number 1. Okay? Rule number 2 has to do with the meatuses that get formed by the conchae. Okay? And so these meatuses are going to, again, be coated by the respiratory epithelium, and they're going to have lots of blood capillaries. Okay? Capillaries are going to have lots of blood, and blood is able to absorb heat. Okay? And so when we inhale air, air is going to be moving through the conchae and the meatuses, brushing past all of these capillaries, and so that is going to help warm the air that we inhale. Okay? That's going to be important because if we're in a situation where we're like in Cleveland in the middle of winter, where it's 7 degrees outside, we don't want to be inhaling very, very cold air like that because that's going to drop our body temperature. Okay? And so this is beneficial because when we're in cold environments, okay, when we're breathing in that cold air, it's going to get warmed up by the blood inside these capillaries and then help to keep our our internal body temperature at an appropriate temperature at about 98.6. Okay? Without these, okay, if we were in cold environments, our body temperature would end up dropping because we're inhaling so much cold air. Okay? So that's going to be really important there.
That's real.
Okay? The third function is going to be the mucus. Okay? And so the mucus has the ability to moisten any air because there's going to be some water in there. And it's going to be able to trap a bunch of like dust particles and pathogens and things like that. Okay? That's going to be really important because like I said before, okay, when we're breathing in, we're not just breathing in air. Okay, we're breathing in pollen, we're breathing in ash, debris, bacteria, viruses, a bunch of different things. Okay? And we want to make sure that that stuff does not get deeper into the respiratory system because then that can cause some significant health issues. Okay? And so what that mucus will do is the mucus is going to catch any of that debris or pathogen or pollen or whatever it may be, catch all that stuff before it gets deeper into the respiratory system. Okay? Once it gets caught by the mucus, then there's going to be some cilia underneath that are able to then brush that stuff out of your system. Okay? And usually what's going to happen is those cilia are going to brush all of that mucus, which caught all the bacteria, downward towards your pharynx. Okay? And then from there, you can then either swallow it or spit it out, which is kind of where we get loogies from. Okay. Kind of gross, but it serves a protective role here. Okay. So do these 3 functions make sense?
Yes.
Do they kind of show you the importance of what's going on with the respiratory epithelium? Okay.
Yes.
Cool. All right. Any questions so far?
I have one. What is it when people have like seasonal allergies? Like I have like really bad allergies. What is the cause of them? Because I know everyone has them.
Yeah. So seasonal allergies are typically because our bodies get sensitive to specific things in the atmosphere. And so, for example, like pollen might be, a seasonal allergy. Like, for example, like I have really bad. And so it doesn't take a lot of that particular allergen to trigger an immune reaction, essentially. And so when we start to breathe all that stuff in, it causes your body to start to say, oh, there's something in here that shouldn't be here, and it kind of goes into overdrive in terms of trying to fight off what that pathogen is. And so what's going to happen is a lot of times you'll start overproducing mucus because your body is recognizing, hey, there's a pathogen or there's something in here that shouldn't be in here. Produces extra mucus to help you catch it, and then you end up kind of having a runny nose because you're producing extra mucus. That's kind of the biggest thing. Sometimes people will deal with kind of more respiratory issues as well, and that's just because the bronchioles and the bronchi start to constrict, so your airways start to close up a little bit, and that's again just kind of an immune reaction that kind of gets kicked into overdrive essentially. So that's kind of what's happening here. Kind of similar things, but also a few other more kind of intense aspects of the immune system.
Thank you. I have them really bad during the spring, so I wanted to know why.
Hey, you and me both. You and me both.
Yeah.
They're tough. Cool. Good question. Any other questions here? No. Okay. Cool. So those are the conchi. Okay. So again, those are going to be found within the lateral walls of the nasal cavity. Okay. So once air moves from the nasal cavity, it's going to move through the internal nares, and then it's going to reach the pharynx. Okay. So the pharynx is going to be a funnel-shaped tube in the back part of your nasal cavity and in the back part of your mouth. Okay. And so it's going to be kind of posterior to the nasal cavity, posterior to the oral cavity, and it's also going to be superior to the larynx and the esophagus, which are down here. Okay. And so this tube is going to be made up of mostly skeletal muscle. Okay. And so when that muscle is going to be relaxed, that's going to be where the pharynx gets more open and remains more kind of relaxed here. Okay. When it's contracted, it's going to help with swallowing. Okay. And so for that reason, the pharynx is kind of a dual purpose structure here. It's going to be important with the respiratory system to help move air from the internal nose down into the lower parts of your respiratory tract. And then it's also going to be an area where food is going to be passing through as well. Okay. And then down into the esophagus. Okay. So that's the first function of the pharynx, kind of acting as a passageway for both air and for food. The second part that's going to be important is it's going to be involved with helping to cause different sounds in your voice. Okay. And then the third thing is it's going to be where we find some of our tonsils. Okay. And so that's going to be kind of a more immune function. So it kind of serves three different functions all kind of at once. Okay. So when we look at the pharynx gets divided up into three regions. Okay. The first region is the nasopharynx, which is just posterior to the nasal cavity here. And so this is also going to be where we find the pharyngeal tonsil, which is also known as your adenoids. Okay. And so inside the nasopharynx, we're going to have lots of ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, which is going to have lots of mucus, okay, lots of goblet cells, which are going to be producing mucus. And so again, that's where we see kind of similar trend like we saw in the nose. Okay. And in fact, this is going to be a similar trend that we're going to see, again, throughout the respiratory tract. So that's the nasopharynx. Okay. When you start to move more inferiorly from the nasopharynx, you're eventually going to reach the oropharynx, okay, which is an opening that which has two openings, one from the nasopharynx and then one from the oropharynx. Okay. Or sorry, the oral cavity. Okay. And so in order to get food or materials or air from the oral cavity into the oropharynx, it's going to be passing through a region called the fauces, okay, which is right here. And then inside the oropharynx, we have the palatine tonsils and the lingual tonsils. Okay? And so for that reason, the oropharynx is going to be a passageway for both air, food, and drinks. Okay? So when we breathe in air through our mouth, it's going to be moving through our oropharynx the oral cavity into the oropharynx. Okay? Food, same thing. And then drinks, also the same kind of mechanism here. And the last region is the laryngopharynx. So as air starts to move from the nasopharynx into the oropharynx, will eventually kind of move more inferiorly into the laryngopharynx. Okay? And so the laryngopharynx is going to be a region that's going to open up into two areas. Okay? Anteriorly, it's going to open up into the larynx, and then posteriorly, it's going to open up into the esophagus. Okay? So it has two openings, one into the larynx and then one into the esophagus. Okay. All right, so those are the three regions of the pharynx. Now, once we start to move past the pharynx, okay, we then reach our larynx, which is the next part of our respiratory tract. Okay. So the larynx, which is also called the voice box, is going to essentially connect the laryngeal pharynx superiorly to the trachea inferiorly. Okay. And so inside the larynx, there's going to be a superior region and then an inferior region. The superior region of the larynx is going to be made up of mostly stratified squamous epithelium, while the inferior region is again going to be made up of ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium with lots of goblet cells, so they're going to be producing lots of mucus here. Okay. And so we have mucus here, and we also have cilia here. Okay. And so just like what we saw previously, if there's any pathogens or bacteria or dust or debris, anything like that, that end up getting past any of these other defenses previously, let's say they get past the mucus in the nose, they get past the mucus in the pharynx, and somehow they manage to make their way into the larynx, there's also going to be some mucus and some cilia there as well. So they're going to be able to catch any types of bacteria that were able to get past any of those previous defenses. Okay. And it's going to work exactly the same way. Okay. So the cilia are going to, or the mucus is going to catch those particular pathogens, whatever they may be, and the cilia are going to start to brush them. But instead of brushing them downward, okay, they're going to be brushing them upward, okay, into the pharynx. Okay. So regardless of where the cilia are, they're always going to be brushing those pathogens up into the pharynx so that you can either, at this point, either reach it into your mouth and spit it out or swallow it down into the esophagus. And that's where you can eliminate those pathogens from the body. Okay, so that is that. Okay. And again, that's kind of where, if you wake up in the morning and you're kind of really congested and you have these loogies, the larynx is going to be where you're going to be kind of pulling some of that gunk from. Okay. All right, so that's the larynx. Okay. So when we take a look at the larynx is going to be made up of a lot of different types of cartilage, about 9 pieces of cartilage. We're going to go through a few of them. Okay. So the first piece of cartilage that we're going to see is called the thyroid cartilage. Okay. And so the thyroid cartilage is formed by 2 plates of hyaline cartilage. Okay. One kind of on this side and one kind of forming it on this side. And so the point where they kind of connect at the point, okay, that is called the laryngeal prominence or your Adam's apple. Okay, so if you feel where your Adam's apple would be, okay, that is where you have the thyroid cartilage, or the 2 plates of thyroid cartilage all coming together. Okay. So the thyroid cartilage helps to form your Adam's apple. And so this is going to make up the anterior and superior portion of the larynx and give it more of a triangular shape up at the top. Okay. In males, the thyroid cartilage tends to be larger just because of the presence of sex hormones, or male sex hormones, I should say. And so the thyroid cartilage gets held in place by a membrane called the thyrohyoid membrane. Okay. And so the thyrohyoid membrane connects the thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone, which is kind of a bone that kind of floats up in your kind of upper throat. Okay, any questions so far on the larynx?
No.
No, okay. All right, cool. So then the next piece of cartilage that's really important is called the epiglottis. Okay. And so the epiglottis is a very large piece of kind of elastic tissue, and it's almost shaped like a leaf. And so the epiglottis is important, again, kind of serving a dual purpose here in terms of, allowing proper digestion to take place, as well as protecting the respiratory tract. Okay. And so it's kind of shaped like a leaf where the inferior portion is going to be attached to the thyroid cartilage, where that's going to be kind of where, if you imagine like the stem of a leaf would be, okay? The stem of the epiglottis would be attached to the thyroid cartilage, while the superior portion is going to be more free and unattached to anything. Okay? And so what happens is when you're swallowing food, okay, for example, the pharynx is going to start to rise up and start to elevate. Okay? When the pharynx elevates, that causes the larynx to also elevate. Okay? And so what happens when the larynx elevates is it causes the epiglottis to flip downward. Okay? Instead of being kind of upward, it's going to flip downward. And so when it flips downward, it covers up the glottis, which is the opening into the trachea, or opening into the larynx, I should say. Okay. And so what happens here is this is going to cover the larynx and essentially force the food to only enter into the esophagus. Okay. Now, if this epiglottis were not here, or if it wasn't working properly, food could possibly enter the esophagus, or it could possibly enter the larynx like we see over here. Okay. And so if food enters the larynx, that is where we end up with our the process of choking. Okay? And so the epiglottis essentially helps us to protect our larynx and protect our airways from food entering it and then causing us to choke. Okay? So when it flips downward, it forces food into the esophagus and away from the larynx. Okay? So really, really important, structure here. Okay. So the glottis, so the epiglottis is going to cover up the glottis when we're swallowing here. And so in the glottis, we would find another mucous membrane. We'd find our vocal cords. And then in between the mucous membrane and the vocal cords, we'd find a structure called the rim of glottis. Okay, don't worry too much about it, just know it's there. Okay, so this is what it would look like from the posterior view. Okay. So the epiglottis is going to be on the posterior side of the larynx. Again, you're going to see the stem of your epiglottis kind of more attached to the thyroid cartilage. And then the superior part, the kind of leaf-shaped part, is going to be the more free end. Okay? And so during swallowing, that part is going to flip downward, okay? Protect the larynx, which is more anterior, and then force the food to enter the esophagus, which is more posterior. Okay? And then again, here we see the thyroid cartilage, which where we have those two plates of cartilage here, kind of forming our Adam's apple. Okay. All right. Any questions on the epiglottis?
No.
No.
Okay. All right, cool. All right, so now the next piece of cartilage that we're going to see is called the cricoid cartilage. And so the cricoid cartilage is going to be a ring of cartilage that's going to be underneath the thyroid cartilage, okay, and more posterior as well. Okay. And so if someone typically needs like a tracheotomy, let's say they're in the hospital and they need an airway to be opened up because all the airways are closed, the cricoid cartilage is going to be near where a tracheotomy would be taking place. So about right up underneath the Adam's apple. Okay. And so the cricoid cartilage is going to be held in place by two ligaments. The first one is the cricotracheal ligament, okay, which is going to be on the posterior side. And so that's going to attach the cricoid cartilage to the first ring of the trachea. Okay. And then there's going to be a cricothyroid ligament, and that's going to be more anterior, and that's going to attach the cricoid cartilage to the thyroid cartilage. Okay. And again, it's going to hold it in place in that area. The last piece of cartilage we're going to be talking about is the arytenoid cartilage. And so the arytenoid cartilage are these two little pieces of triangular cartilage here. And so these little pieces of cartilage are going to be important because when they move, they're going to be able to influence the way your vocal cords are positioned. Okay, and that's going to create different acoustics to your voice. And that's going to allow you to be able to make your voice deeper or make your voice higher or create different sounds within your voice just by the movement of the arytenoid cartilage, okay, which is attached to your vocal cords. Okay. And so again, they're going to be on the posterior side. They're going to be kind of sitting more superior to the cricoid cartilage. Okay. So those are the pieces of cartilage I want you to be comfortable with. Okay, the thyroid cartilage, the epiglottis, the cricoid cartilage, and the arytenoid cartilage. Okay. Those are the only four I want you to worry about for the exam. Okay. Okay, so question here. So in the figure shown, what structure is indicated? Okay, are we looking at the oropharynx, the epiglottis, the laryngopharynx, the esophagus, or the trachea?
See the laryngopharynx.
Laryngopharynx. Yeah.
Right, this would be the laryngopharynx. Perfect. So if we were to, take this arrow and move it upward, back here, what region would this be right here?
Oropharynx.
Right, this would be the oropharynx. Exactly. Beautiful. So we have our oropharynx here, okay? And then as we move inferiorly, we reach our laryngopharynx. Okay, perfect. Okay, any questions so far?
No.
Okay, so with that, we're gonna go ahead and move into the next region. So our next region is the trachea. So as we move past the larynx, we're going to move more inferiorly, and we're going to reach a very long tube called the trachea. Okay. And so the trachea is a very long tubular passageway, which is also called the windpipe. And again, that's going to move air from the larynx and eventually help us reach the lungs. So the trachea is going to be more anterior to the esophagus, and it's going to extend from the larynx, like I said, down into the chest, into the thorax, at about the level of the T5 vertebra. And once you get to about that point, the trachea is going to split into the right and left primary bronchi, or the right and left main bronchi. All right, so we're going to take a look at the way it's structured here. And so there's going to be four regions or four layers to the trachea. The first layer is called the mucosa. Okay? And so as you can probably tell by the name, the mucosa is going to be lined with a very substantial mucous membrane. Okay? So again, just like we've seen previously in the respiratory tract, we're going to have ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. We're going to have some goblet cells, which are going to be producing mucus. And then we're going to have lots of elastic tissue and lots of reticular fibers. Okay. So we're going to be able to produce lots of mucus here, and lots of, we're going to have lots of cilia here as well. So if, again, for some reason, if there's some kind of pathogen that ends up making its way past the defenses in the nose, past the defenses in the pharynx, past the defenses in the larynx, and finds its way in the trachea, we're still able to catch it in the trachea and still be able to push it more superiorly and push it up to the pharynx. So there's multiple places in the respiratory tract where we're able to defend ourselves against all of these different types of debris that we may be bringing in or inhaling. Okay, so that's the mucosa. Okay. The second layer, just superficial to the mucosa, is the submucosa. And so the submucosa is going to have lots of connective tissue with lots of these mucus glands as well, okay, and some ducts present as well. Nothing too much happening there. The third layer is called the fibromusculocartilaginous layer. Okay, start saying that about 5 times fast. So the fibromusculocartilaginous layer is a C-shaped cartilaginous ring. Okay, and so it almost looks like a horseshoe. And so the open portion of our C, okay, of our C shape here, is going to be oriented more posteriorly up against the esophagus. And so, like I said, this is going to be made up of a ring of cartilage, which we see over here. Okay. So inside the fibromusculocartilaginous layer, there's going to be about 16 to 20 of these, I'll kind of breeze through here, 16 to 20 of these stacked rings of cartilage, okay, or semi-rings of cartilage, okay, all running from the trachea more superficial or superiorly all the way down to before we get to the bronchi. Okay. And so this region is going to be really important because we're going to have a few things that are going to really be helping to make sure that this pathway stays open. Okay. There's going to be a fibromuscular membrane, and so this fibromuscular membrane is going to be here at the posterior region, okay, where we have this open part of our cartilage. Okay. And inside the fibromuscular membrane, there's going to be a muscle called the trachealis muscle. Okay. This trachealis muscle is going to be really important because this is what's going to allow your trachea to be able to constrict just a little bit and expand just a little bit. Okay. And that's going to be important during inhalation and exhalation. Okay. So when we inhale, okay, the trachealis muscle is going to relax a little bit. And as it relaxes, that's going to be able to allow more air into your lungs. Okay. And then if we need to exhale, the trachealis muscle is going to constrict a little bit. And as it constricts, it's going to close up the diameter of the trachea just a little bit to help force the air out. Okay. So this is what's going to help to regulate the size of your, the lumen of your trachea. Okay. The other thing that's important about these rings is because they're made up of cartilage, they're going to help maintain or kind of keep the trachea open. Okay, because they're pretty rigid, okay, it's going to prevent the trachea from closing all the way up or opening all the way up. Okay, it's going to be mostly a rigid structure it's pretty much never going to close up altogether. Okay, because of the rigidness of those cartilaginous rings. Okay. And then the outermost or the most superficial layer of the trachea is the adventitia. Okay. And so the adventitia is just a region of connective tissue, and that is just going to hold the trachea in place so it attaches to any surrounding tissues, again, to just kind of hold it in place. Cool. So innermost layer, we have the mucosa. We have our ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium with lots of goblet cells. Then we have the submucosa just superficial to that. Okay. Superficial to that, we're going to have our fibromusculocartilaginous layer, okay, which is going to be made up of this cartilage arranged like a C shape, okay, with the open portion in the posterior region. And then we have the adventitia on the outside. Okay. And that just attaches the trachea to surrounding tissues. Okay, so those are the 4 layers of the trachea. And so if we were to kind of look at this through a cadaver, this is kind of what we would see. Here we would see our cartilaginous ring, our tracheal cartilage here. Okay, again, oriented like a C shape. In the posterior region, we have our trachealis muscle, which helps to constrict or relax the trachea. And here we have the esophagus, just on the posterior side. And then again, over here, we see some of the goblet cells. We see some ciliated epithelial cells from the pseudostratified epithelium. Yeah, so kind of seeing a few different things here. Okay, questions on the trachea?
No.
Okay. All right, then once we move past the trachea is going to divide into 2 tubes. Okay? These tubes are called the right and the left main bronchi, or sometimes called the primary bronchi. So we have a right main bronchus and then a left main bronchus on this side. Okay. So again, just like the trachea, we're going to have these incomplete rings of cartilage that make up our bronchi here. Okay. And again, just like previously, they're going to be made up of the ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Those are our left and right main bronchi. Okay. Now again, the point where the trachea divides into those bronchi is what's called the carina. Okay. So the trachea will get to the carina, and when we reach the carina, the trachea will then split into the primary bronchi. Okay. Inside the primary bronchi, there's some receptors that are very, very sensitive to just anything. Okay. When anything touches those receptors, it triggers the cough reflex and causes you to start coughing. And so this is kind of another defense mechanism to help you get rid of any pathogens or ash or debris that's gone into the respiratory system that found its way past the trachea here. Okay. Now, one thing that's kind of important more clinically about the right main bronchus is that in comparison to the left one, the right bronchus is more more vertically oriented than the left one. It's a little bit shorter, and it's a little bit wider than the left one is. Okay. The reason this is important is because when we have children that are up to like 3 or 4 years old, sometimes they like to stick toys into their nose or start to swallow different toys because they're kind of learning about small objects around them. Okay. And so when they start to take those things in, either shove it up their nose into the rest of their respiratory system, or if they swallow it and it gets lodged into the respiratory system, the place where those objects will usually get lodged is inside the right main bronchus. Okay. And the reason for that is because it's more vertical, so gravity kind of helps it to fall more easily into that bronchus than the left one, and it's wider, and so it has a larger area, so things will most likely get lodged in the right bronchus than the left one. Okay. And so for that reason, if that happens, parents kind of freak out. They'll take their kid to the doctor, as they should. Take them to the doctor, and then the doctor can then kind of remove that object out of the respiratory tract. Okay. It's a very difficult and kind of uncomfortable process, as you can probably imagine. But this is where things typically will get lodged when babies aspirate different types of toys and things like that around. Okay, so that's that. Okay, so the bronchi are going to be located at about the T5 level. And so once we get to about the T5 level, the trachea is going to split into the bronchi. And when the right main bronchus splits, it's going to split into the secondary bronchi, or also called the lobar bronchi. Okay. And each lobar bronchus will supply a specific region or a specific lobe of the lung, I should say. Cool. Okay. Any questions on the bronchi so far?
No.
Okay. All right. So we have our right main bronchus dividing up into the lobar bronchi, and then from there, the lobar bronchi will then divide further into the segmental bronchi, okay, or sometimes called the tertiary bronchi. And so the segmental bronchi are going to supply specific bronchopulmonary segments with oxygen within each lobe of the lung. Okay. So each lobe, as we'll kind of look at in a bit here, is each lobe is going to have multiple different segments within it, multiple different bronchopulmonary segments. And each of those bronchopulmonary segments will be supplied by a segmental bronchus. From there, the segmental bronchi will then divide into the bronchioles. Okay. And so the bronchioles are going to contain a few different things here. Number one, they're going to contain some chlorocells. And so these chlorocells are able to protect against different types of toxins and any kind of carcinogen that we breathe in. They're able to produce some surfactant, and which we'll talk about in a second here. And then they'll also be producing some stem cells. So some of the chlorocells can actually act as stem cells for the body as well. Okay. So again, we'll talk about surfactant in a little more detail. We've talked about it already in chapter 4, but we'll get to that in a little bit more specifics in a bit here. Okay. Then we have our bronchi dividing further and branching into the terminal bronchi. Okay. And so the terminal bronchi are the end of the conducting zone. Okay, so again, up until this point, we have not done any kind of gas exchange. Okay, we're not exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide. Up until this point, we're just moving oxygen, or moving air, I should say, from our environment into the lungs. Okay, no gas exchange is taking place. Okay. And so this very extensive branching from the bronchi all the way down to the terminal bronchioles is what we refer to as the bronchial tree. Okay. So this entire structure here is the bronchial tree, and it kind of looks like a tree if you kind of look at it upside down. Here you have all the branches and the leaves, or kind of, you can imagine where the leaves would be. All these branches where you would have kind of your trunk being the trachea here. Okay. So this would be your bronchial tree. Okay. So now when we get into the bronchi, we're going to see some specific cells starting to take place here. Okay. So what's going to happen is in the bronchi, we're going to have our normal ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, just like normal. Okay. Once we start moving into the larger bronchioles, okay, these bronchioles are going to switch from having pseudostratified epithelium to now simple columnar epithelium. Okay. But it's still going to be ciliated inside those bronchioles. Okay. Once we start moving into the terminal bronchioles, then it starts to switch again, and now we have more non-ciliated, simple cuboidal epithelium. Okay. But throughout this whole process, we're still going to have our goblet cells that will still be producing mucus, and they're going to be operating the exact same way. So the cilia are still going to be able to move all those different pathogens towards your pharynx if they get past any of those previous defenses. Okay. So kind of like I said before, there's multiple different areas, okay, where our bodies have the ability to trap particles and trap pathogens and things like that when they enter the body, okay, and move them again towards the pharynx. Okay, so then once we start to move, kind of deeper into the bronchial tree, eventually we're going to start to lose cartilage, and that those incomplete rings of cartilage are eventually going to get replaced with these thicker plates of cartilage. Okay, and so that's going to be happening within the bronchioles. Once you get into the more distal bronchioles, you start to lose that cartilage. And then once you start to lose cartilage, you eventually begin to replace it with smooth muscle instead. Okay? And so the more distal bronchioles are going to have smooth muscle as opposed to being made up of cartilage. Okay. Okay. All right, so now, when we're looking at the bronchi and when we're looking at the bronchioles here, the bronchioles are going to also be regulated by the autonomic nervous system, okay, where we have our fight or flight mode or our rest and digest mode. Okay, so when we're looking at our sympathetic division, okay, when we're in fight or flight, okay, that's going to cause our bodies to start releasing epinephrine and a hormone called norepinephrine. Okay, and so this is going to be kind of an emergency situation. So let's say, for example, we're running away from a bear. Okay. When we're running away from a bear, we're going to want to make sure that our airways are open, because the more that our airways are open, the more air we're going to be able to get in, and if we bring in more air, we're going to be able to deliver more oxygen to our muscles to help us get away from that danger, our bear in this case. Okay. So the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is involved with causing your smooth muscle in the bronchioles to relax. Okay. And when they relax, it dilates the airways, and so that improves your ability to have ventilation. Okay. So that air moves into your lungs and your alveoli a little bit quicker. Okay. The flip side of that is if we're in rest and digest, when we're just eating this, this big hefty meal, the parasympathetic division is going to be activated. And so this is going to cause constriction, okay, of our smooth muscle. Okay. And so when our smooth muscle constricts, that's going to cause our distal bronchioles to constrict, and then we're not able to bring in as much air because we don't really need it. It's not as crucial to survival at that point. So the nervous system is going to be involved with regulating the diameter of your airways at any point in time. Okay, so that kind of leads us into a couple different conditions here. The first condition that we can have is called asthma. So asthma is a pretty common respiratory condition. And so this usually develops when people are exposed to specific triggers. Sometimes it can be pollen, sometimes it can be dust. In some cases, it can be exercise that can be a trigger. But the trigger doesn't need to be present in large concentrations. Okay, it only takes a little bit to create that asthmatic reaction. And so when someone deals with asthma, what happens is their bronchioles begin to constrict and cause the smooth muscle to go into spasm. Okay. When they go into spasm, they're constricting, and that causes the lumen of the bronchioles to either close up a little bit, or in some cases, in some severe cases, it can cause those airways to close up altogether. And so because air is moving through a smaller diameter, it causes the air to move in a more turbulent manner. Okay. And like we looked at with blood when we were looking at blood turbulence, it's going to create a sound. Okay. Air is going to work exactly the same way. Okay, so because air is moving more in a turbulent manner, it creates a sound that is typically characterized as wheezing, okay, in people who are dealing with asthma. And someone who's dealing with asthma, they'll usually be able to hear their wheezing from across the room. And again, that's just going to be due to air moving through a smaller area. And so for people to kind of be treated with asthma, usually the pulmonologist or a doctor will give them an inhaler. And so the inhaler is going to have what's called a beta, I think it's a beta agonist, or either beta agonist or beta antagonist, can't remember which one. But essentially what that does is it causes the smooth muscles in the bronchioles to relax. And so when you take that breath from the inhaler, your smooth muscle in your bronchioles relax, and it allows your airways to open up and allows you to be able to breathe a little bit better. Okay. So that's kind of how asthma works. Kind of a pretty severe, typically can be pretty severe if it happens. And in some cases, it can actually be pretty dangerous. Okay. The second condition I want to bring to your attention is this is one that I do want you to be comfortable with for the exam as well. And so this is called chronic bronchitis. Okay. So chronic bronchitis falls under kind of a family of diseases called chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. Okay. You've probably heard of COPD from a lot of these, from a lot of commercials where people are dealing with either targeting smokers or people who are ex-smokers because of different lung diseases. Okay. So I'll kind of write COPD kind of right over here. So COPD. Okay. So COPD is a family of disorders, a family of obstructive pulmonary disorders that happen inside the lung. Okay. The first one is called chronic bronchitis, which is a type of disorder under COPD. Okay. And so the way chronic bronchitis works is you pretty much have extra inflammation happening inside the bronchi due to long periods of, or smoking for long periods of time. Okay. And so when people smoke for long periods of time, it affects the bronchi. And so they cause excess production of mucus. Okay. And so this is kind of a two-pronged attack here. And so what happens here is when there's some kind of irritant that gets inhaled, it causes extra inflammation inside the bronchi. Okay. And so when you produce that extra inflammation, it causes the bronchi to increase in size, increase the size of their goblet cells, and increase the size of their mucus glands. Okay. And so when you cause those glands and the goblet cells to increase in size, you start producing extra mucus, okay, and kind of an excessive amount of mucus. Okay. Now you're producing lots of mucus here, so that's going to kind of be a problem because number one, you're going to be kind of constricting your airway just because you have extra mucus present. But number two, the extra mucus that you have tends to weigh down the cilia. Okay? And so what happens here is when someone takes in some kind of pathogen or some kind of debris or bacteria or whatever it may be, the mucus is going to do its job in terms of trapping that pathogen there. But because there's so much mucus, it weighs down the cilia. And so the cilia don't have any way of brushing that mucus up towards your pharynx to help you get rid of it. Okay. And so what happens is the mucus just kind of sits there, and the pathogen or bacteria sits there as well, continues to multiply, and then you end up with having your pathogens and bacteria multiplying inside your airways, okay, and inside your secretions here. Okay. And so that can be a significant problem because now you're creating lots of infections that you're not able to get rid of because you're producing too much mucus. And so people who are dealing with bronchitis or chronic bronchitis will usually be dealing with cough, as you can probably imagine, shortness of breath because their airways are constricted, wheezing for the same reason, cyanosis because there's smaller airways, so it's going to be harder to get oxygen in, and then pulmonary hypertension as well because your lungs have to work a little bit harder and your heart's going to have to work harder too. Okay. So like I said, this is one that I do want you to be familiar with. I want you to be comfortable with how this particular kind of mechanism works, how you end up with chronic bronchitis.
I have a question.
Yes.
So the pathogen sitting there with the mucus, does it get really thick and that's why the cilia can't push it?
Not the pathogen sitting there, but because there's so much mucus.
Oh, okay.
So it's kind of like, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay, so because you're producing so much mucus, so your cilia are only able to withstand so much weight, essentially. Okay? If there's a certain amount of weight, they can be able to push it towards the mucus, as long as you're below that weight threshold. Okay? But when you start to produce extra mucus, it causes the cilia to not be able to move because there's so much weight that they're having to kind of hold up. Okay? So because they're being weighed down by all that extra mucus, the pathogens can't go anywhere and the mucus can't go anywhere. So because the pathogens just kind of sit there, they're able to continue to divide without anything happening to them. Okay, they just continue to divide without any of the immune cells or immune system being able to actually get to it, or get to it as effectively, I should say. Does that make more sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Cool.
So I have a question too. So about tuberculosis, is it related to any of what we talked about today?
So tuberculosis kind of works in a similar fashion, but a little bit different. It's more complicated, and it kind of has to do with some fluid as well, but not necessarily the mucus itself, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's kind of a different pathway here.
Okay.
Cool. Any other questions?
No.
Okay, cool. All right, so that is the first type of, or first, the first type of COPD kind of disorder here. Cool. All right. Okay, so this is kind of a picture of our lungs, like just a larger picture to help you see it a little bit better. Here is a picture of the bronchioles under an electron microscope. So again, here you're able to see the lumen. Here you would see the smooth muscle around it to help it kind of constrict and expand. You see some epithelium where you're going to see the ciliated pseudostratified epithelium, and some connective tissue on the outside. Okay, this is a kind of picture of you to kind of open up the lungs and cut through a frontal cut. Here you would see the trachea splitting into the right and left primary bronchi, okay, and then they start to divide into the secondary bronchi and then the tertiary bronchi, which will lead into the lungs itself. Okay, and this is what it would look like if you were to pull the entire bronchial tree out of the body. Okay. And then again, here you see the thyroid cartilage of the larynx, the epiglottis up here, and this is a posterior view too. Okay, so question here. So which of the following is or are functions of the internal structures of the nose? Okay, so number 1, we got filtering incoming air. 2 is moistening incoming air. 3 is detecting olfactory or smell stimuli. Yes. 4, warming incoming air. Or 5, modifying speech vibrations.
I think all of it.
That's all, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, all of them. Yeah, so the nose is going to be involved with all of these different functions here. Right. Mm-hmm. Okay, so up until this point, again, we've only been looking at the conducting zone. Okay, this is just where we're moving air from the outside of our environment eventually into, as they enter kind of the lungs here. Okay, and so up to this point, we're having a total of about 16 generations of branching taking place. Okay, from the trachea to the bronchi, there's about 10 or I guess 9 branches from the lobar of the segmental bronchi, and then 11 through 16 are in the bronchioles and terminal bronchioles. Okay. After the terminal bronchioles, we're eventually going to reach into the respiratory zone, where we'll find our respiratory bronchioles, our alveolar ducts, and then our alveolar sacs. Okay. So before we get into the respiratory, respiratory zone, we're going to take a look at the lungs. Okay. And so the lungs are these very large cone-shaped organs that sit inside your thoracic cavity. Okay. And so these lungs are not going to make any direct contact with one another because they're going to be separated from each other by the heart, which is going to sit in the middle of the two. Okay. And so the lungs are going to extend from the diaphragm. Okay. I'll kind of show a picture down here. They're going to be extended from the diaphragm, which will be down here, up until you've reached just a little bit superior to the clavicles. Okay. And so that would be where we find the apex of our lungs. Okay. So the base of the lung is going to sit on top of the diaphragm. Okay. That's going to be the inferior portion of the lung. Okay. The apex of the lung is going to be the superior region that sits, just a little bit higher than the clavicle. Okay. Now, when we take a look at the left and the right lungs, okay, the right lung is going to be a bit bigger than the left lung. Okay. Does anyone have an idea why the left lung would be smaller than the right?
Because of the liver, right?
Not because of the liver.
Oh, on the left side.
The heart sits, most of the heart sits there, or something.
Right, because most of the heart is going to sit on the left side.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so because the heart is such a vital organ and it's going to sit mostly on the left side of your thoracic cavity, the left lung has to be a little bit smaller in order to accommodate the space that the heart takes up. Okay. And so the left lung is going to be a little smaller because it has to allow the heart to take up a certain amount of space as well. Okay. So for that reason, the left lung is going to have a structure that the right lung does not. And that structure is called the cardiac notch. Okay. This cardiac notch is going to be a kind of a little divot inside the left lung, okay, where the heart is going to kind of project into. Or where the apex of the heart is going to project into. Okay, does that make sense so far?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Now, when we look at the mediastinal surface, which is the medial surface of your lungs, there's going to be a region called the hilum. Okay, and so the hilum is going to be an area where we have a bunch of tubes entering the lung. Okay, so inside the hilum, we're going to find some bronchi. We're going to find the pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins, and we're going to find the lymphatic vessels, and then we're going to find some nerves. Okay. So that's going to be where all of those different structures are going to enter and exit from the lungs. Okay. And again, that's going to be on the medial surface, okay, inside the hilum on the mediastinal surface of the lungs. Okay. There's another surface, which is called the costal surface, and so that is a surface that actually lies up against the ribs. So here we can see our lungs sitting right up against our ribs over here. And so this is where we would find the costal surface. Okay? Any part of the lungs that actually makes contact with the ribs is referred to as the costal surface. Okay, so here's a picture here. If we were to kind of look at a healthy lung tissue, you can kind of see the imprints of the ribs. Okay, this will be where we see our costal surface. Here we see the cardiac notch of the left lung. And then if you look at the medial surfaces, we can see where we would find the hilum. And then again, of course, we see the base where we would be sitting on top of the diaphragm, and then the apex, which is the more superior portion. Okay, so when we take a look at the lungs, okay, the lung is going to be coated by another type of serous membrane. And again, if you remember, serous membranes are these double-layered membranes that will surround a particular organ. Okay. The first region of, or I guess the kind of that serous membrane is called the pleural membrane. Okay. And so this pleural membrane is going to have two layers to it. The first layer of the pleural membrane is called the parietal pleura. Okay. This is this red region right here. Okay. And so that is going to line the entire wall of the thoracic cavity. The second layer is called the visceral pleura. And so the visceral pleura will sit right on top of the lungs themselves. Okay. in between the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura is going to be a space called the pleural space. And that space is going to be filled with a fluid, or sorry, the pleural cavity. And so inside the pleural cavity, you're going to have what's called the pleural fluid. That pleural fluid is going to be important because that's going to allow the lungs to be able to expand and contract smoothly, okay, without kind of causing abrasions or without kind of bumping into anything in particular. Okay. So it's going to be able to allow them to kind of move in a smooth manner. Okay. All right, so that's the pleural membrane. Okay, so now when we take a look at the lobes of the lung, there's going to be some fissures inside the lungs that are going to make up different lobes. Okay. So the first fissure that both lungs will have is called the oblique fissure. Okay. And so the oblique fissure, as you can probably tell by its name, is going to run in an oblique manner, okay, running anteriorly and inferiorly, and kind of more medially as well. Okay. So when we look at the left lung, okay, the left lung is only going to have an oblique fissure. And so that oblique fissure is going to separate that lung into a superior lobe and then an inferior lobe. The right lung is going to have an additional fissure because it's a bit bigger here. Okay? And so the right lung is going to have an additional fissure called the horizontal fissure. Okay? And so when we look at the right lung, the combination of the horizontal fissure and the inferior fissure, or sorry, the oblique fissure, are going to separate the lung into the superior lobe, the middle lobe, and the inferior lobe. Okay. So in the left lung, we have an oblique fissure that separates it into the superior lobe and inferior lobe. When we look at the right lobe, or sorry, the right lung, we have a horizontal fissure and an oblique fissure, and that separates the lung into the superior, middle, and inferior lobes. You can see over there. Okay, so when we take a look at these lobes, okay, remember each of these lobes of the lung is going to be supplied by a lobar bronchus. Okay? So when we have our main bronchus, okay, right and left main bronchus, it's going to divide into the superior, middle, and inferior lobar bronchi. Okay? For the right lung, and then for the left lung, just the superior or inferior lobar bronchus. Okay? So again, each lobar bronchus is going to supply a specific lobe of the lung. Okay. And then from there, each of the lobar bronchi are then going to branch even further into the segmental bronchi. And those segmental bronchi are going to supply specific bronchopulmonary segments. So I'll kind of go back over here. So before I go forward here, are there any questions on the lobes of the lung and the lobar bronchi and kind of how they relate to each other?
No.
So how many lobes are we talking about? Is it 4 or?
So there's a total of 5 lobes.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a total of 5 lobes. Okay, in the left lung, you're looking at just 2 lobes. Okay, the superior lobe and the inferior lobe. Okay, so just 2 for the left.
Mm-hmm.
For the right lung, we have the superior, middle, and inferior lobes. So 3 lobes on the left lung.
Okay.
Cool.
So 3 lobes
Any
on
other
the
questions?
right lung and 2 lobes on the left lung.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so actually, if we kind of move backward here, we kind of see the same thing when we look at these lungs over here. So here we see the oblique fissure separating the lung into the superior lobe and the inferior lobe. Here in the right lung, we see the superior lobe, the middle lobe, and the inferior lobe, okay, being made by the horizontal and the oblique fissures over here. Okay. Any other questions?
We'll need to know the names of the fissures for the lungs, right? Or
Yes, yeah. So you will need to know the names of those fissures.
okay.
And again, there's only 2 names for so both of them are going to have the oblique fissure, and the right lung will have a horizontal fissure in addition to the oblique fissure.
Okay.
So yeah, so be comfortable with those names.
Okay.
Okay. So then from there, like I said, the lobar bronchi are going to divide into the segmental bronchi. Okay? And so the segmental bronchi are going to supply these bronchopulmonary segments. Okay? So each lobe of the lung is going to have a specific segment that's going to be, or a specific region that's going to be supplied by the tertiary bronchi or the segmental bronchi. Okay? Inside those bronchopulmonary segments, we're going to have these little individual lobules. And so this would be a picture of an entire lobule here. Okay. Inside of our lobules, we're going to have a few structures. Okay, so we're first going to have our respiratory bronchioles, which is the first part of our respiratory zone. Okay. And then we're going to have some alveoli. Okay. So the respiratory bronchioles, the terminal bronchioles are going to divide into the respiratory bronchioles as well as into the alveoli here. Okay. In order to get to the alveoli, the respiratory bronchioles are going to divide into these alveolar ducts, okay? And these alveolar ducts are going to be made up of simple squamous epithelium. Okay? And so this epithelium, this alveolar duct will eventually lead into our alveoli. Okay, so that's that. Okay, so this is what the bronchopulmonary segments would look like. So again, in each lobe of the lung, there's going to be multiple different bronchopulmonary segments, and each of these is going to be supplied by a specific segmental bronchus. Okay. This is just a picture of what the lobule looks like. This is what it would look like under a microscope if we were to look at the respiratory bronchioles dividing into the alveolar ducts. And then all of these little individual kind of circular structures here are all the alveoli. It's kind of a little empty space looking structures, and we'll look at those in more detail. Okay, those are the alveoli. Okay. So now we get into the alveolar sacs. Okay, and so the alveolar sacs almost look like these clusters of grapes. Okay, and so each of these would be, this would be one alveolar sac, this would be another alveolar sac, here's a third alveolar sac, and so on and so forth. Okay, these clusters of grapes are the alveolar sacs, and so those are where the alveolar ducts will end. Okay. So we have our alveolar ducts, and they're going to open up into all of these alveolar sacs. Each of the alveolar sacs will contain multiple alveoli in them. Okay, so these alveoli would be kind of each of these individual grapes inside of our cluster here. Okay, and so each of the alveoli are going to share a common opening into the alveolar ducts, and the alveoli are going to be important because this is where gas exchange will actually take place in the lungs. Okay, so if you remember, in order to get carbon dioxide out of the pulmonary arteries and into the pulmonary veins, carbon dioxide out into the alveoli and get oxygen into the pulmonary capillaries, we're going to need our pulmonary, actually, let me try saying that one more time. So when we have deoxygenated blood that we need to oxygenate, okay, that oxygenation is going to be happening inside the pulmonary capillaries, just like what we've kind of already known so far. Those pulmonary capillaries are going to be sitting right on top of all of these alveoli. Okay? And so the alveoli are going to be the region where gas exchange will actually take place. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. So the pulmonary capillaries inside the lungs, okay, are specifically going to be surrounding all of our alveoli here. Okay? And so when we're looking at an alveolus, okay, just a single alveolus here, our alveolus is going to be made up of two types of alveolar cells. Okay. We're going to type 1 alveolar cells and then type 2 alveolar cells. The type 1 alveolar cells are going to be made up of simple squamous cells, okay, simple squamous epithelial cells, which we see kind of all coding right here. These would all be our type 1 alveolar cells. Okay. Now, because it's simple squamous epithelium, okay, different types of materials are going to be easily able to move across the membrane. Okay. And so here we see our pulmonary capillaries, okay? And so this is going to be coming from our pulmonary arteries, which are deoxygenated, okay? And so inside the pulmonary, when the pulmonary arteries eventually reach the pulmonary capillaries, okay, we're going to be delivering carbon dioxide out of the blood, okay? And then picking up oxygen and dropping that into the blood, okay? And then from there, the pulmonary capillaries will now have oxygenated blood that will eventually empty into the pulmonary veins. Okay, so I'll kind of just write that out here. Okay. So our pulmonary, I'll just put PA again. Pulmonary arteries. are going to start leading into our pulmonary capillaries, which are deoxygenated. Okay, they're going to deliver carbon dioxide into the alveoli, and then from there we're going to be able to exhale that carbon dioxide. Okay. At the same time, we're delivering carbon dioxide into the lungs, into the alveoli, and then our pulmonary capillaries are going to be picking up oxygen. Okay. Once they pick up oxygen, we're going to have oxygenated blood inside of our pulmonary capillaries, and these will then lead into our pulmonary veins, which will lead into the left atrium, and when they go back into the heart. Okay. And then from there, that's going to be the blood that we end up pumping out to the rest of the body.
Yes.
Okay. So this is going to be specifically the site of gas exchange happening across the type 1 alveolar cells, okay, and the pulmonary capillaries. Okay. Does that make sense so far?
Yes.
Okay, any questions before we go forward here? Because this is the point that's going to be important. Any questions?
No.
No? Okay, cool.
Good.
Okay, so those are the type 1 alveolar cells. The type 2 alveolar cells are going to be more, kind of more cuboidal cells, and they're going to start producing a fluid called alveolar fluid. Okay, these are going to be these guys over here. So inside the alveolar fluid, we're going to be able to produce a molecule called surfactant, okay? And so what surfactant does is it essentially prevents the alveoli from collapsing in on itself, okay? The reason that's important is because we need these alveoli to be open so that they can allow oxygen and, be able to allow oxygen to be able to enter, and then from there, allow the oxygen to enter into our capillaries, okay? So this prevents our alveoli from collapsing and then closing up to air. Okay? And we'll talk about that in a second here. The third type of cell we're going to see inside the alveoli are going to be the alveolar macrophages. Okay? And so these macrophages are going to be these types of white blood cells that are able to destroy any kind of dust or debris or pollen or pathogens or things like that that have managed to make their way into the lungs. Okay? So again, there's multiple areas, multiple steps where we're able to defend ourselves against these different pathogens that we happen to breathe in. Okay? This would be the last kind of possible area where we're going to be having any type of immune process happening inside the airways. Okay. So that is going to lead us into looking at surfactant here. Okay, so surfactant, we talked about a little bit when we were looking in chapter 4, but surfactant is a molecule that helps our bodies, help our alveoli to prevent from collapsing in on itself. And so when we're born, or before we're born, about 2 weeks before mom ends up giving birth to us, she's going to release a hormone that's going to start triggering her unborn baby to start producing surfactant. Okay? And so what happens is start producing surfactant, and so by the time the baby ends up getting born, they've developed enough surfactant to pop their lungs open. Okay? So when you're first born, your lungs are pretty much completely closed. All of your alveoli are closed. When you take that first breath, okay, you pretty much exert a lot of effort to help pop your lungs open, and then the surfactant helps to keep your alveoli open. Okay, so after that first breath, they might collapse a little bit, and then they'll expand again because of the surfactant, and then they'll collapse a little bit less, and they'll stay open. Okay, contract a little bit less, stay open, collapse a little less, and stay open until they eventually just stay open all the time. Okay, and so again, that helps to keep oxygen flowing into the alveoli, so that you can then take that oxygen and deliver it into the capillaries, okay, the pulmonary capillaries. Okay. Now, in premature babies are not able to produce any surfactant. Okay, so if babies are born before that 2-week, pre-labor period, okay, they never get the signal to start producing surfactant. Okay, and so if they're born before that 2-week, mark, okay, before that 36 or 34-week mark, they don't have any surfactant available. Okay, and so when they start to be born, okay, if a doctor knows that, or if a OB/GYN knows that a mom is going to be delivering birth prematurely, they'll inject the mom with a certain kind of solution that essentially jumpstarts the baby's ability to start producing surfactant. In certain cases where that isn't able to happen, the baby kind of will be born without surfactant and the lungs will be pretty much closed. And so they'll need to be on a ventilator in order to help them be able to breathe and cause their lungs to be able to expand in order to allow oxygen into their system. Okay. So surfactant, like I said, just helps to keep your alveoli open. The more open they are, the more they're able to deliver oxygen into your pulmonary capillaries and oxygenate your blood. Any questions on surfactant here?
If they inject the mom with it, is it a synthetic version of surfactant, or what is it that they inject her with?
It's not a synthetic version. It's not surfactant itself, but it's something that jumpstarts the baby's ability to start producing surfactant.
Okay.
So by the time, and so they'll do that typically maybe a couple of weeks before they anticipate the labor taking place, or sometimes a little bit sooner, depending on the situation. And so once that happens, depending on how soon that is able to take place, the baby will still be able to produce a little bit of surfactant, but depending on the circumstances, the baby may still need a little bit of, and may need the help of a ventilator to help keep their lungs open, because they may not have enough surfactant to keep their alveoli open.
Okay.
Yeah, good question. Any other questions here? Okay, cool. Okay, so that's surfactant here. Okay. So now, this whole membrane where we're going to be transporting our oxygen and carbon dioxide into the alveoli is what we call the respiratory membrane. Okay. So that respiratory membrane is going to be made up of the alveolus and made up of the capillary walls, and that's going to be where we exchange, oxygen and carbon dioxide. And so there's going to be a total of 4 layers that are going to make up the respiratory membrane. The first layer is the alveolar wall. Okay, so if we kind of zoom in to our alveolus here, we're going to have our alveolar wall, which is going to be made up of our type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells. Okay. So that's going to be where we find our oxygen and carbon dioxide, okay, our gases. Okay. The second layer is going to be the basement membrane, the epithelial basement membrane of the alveolus. Okay. Okay. The next layer is the capillary basement membrane. And so the capillary basement membrane is going to be attached to the epithelial basement membrane. And the last layer is the endothelial walls of your capillaries. Okay. So there's 4 very, very, very thin membranes. So the respiratory membrane as a whole is very thin. Because it's so thin, we have very easy, very rapid exchange of gases, very rapid diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide across this respiratory membrane. Okay. So if we were to kind of take a look at what our alveolus would look like under a microscope, and this is what it would look like. So you'd see your simple squamous epithelium and making up the type 1 alveolar cells. And all this white space in here would be the air spaces inside the alveolus. Okay. And so this would be an alveolus, this would be another alveolus. Okay. And so these are going to be very small little structures that are going to be able to deliver oxygen and nutrients across the alveolar walls. Okay, so there's a second condition. So kind of going back to COPD. Okay. So COPD, like I mentioned before, COPD is going to be made up of chronic bronchitis as one of those diseases. Okay. The secondary disease, or the second disease, is called emphysema. So I'll just put CB for chronic bronchitis, and then emphysema is the second one. I'll just put emphy. Okay. So emphysema is the second kind of disease under the COPD umbrella. Okay. And so with emphysema, what happens is the alveolar walls end up getting destroyed. And so again, this can be due to people who have been smoking for long periods of time. Okay. And so the alveolar walls end up getting destroyed. So your alveoli should typically look like these nice little healthy spheres, okay, very small spheres. But if they get damaged and we destroy the alveolar walls, you end up with very large alveoli, okay, these very large openings, the very large air spaces inside your alveoli. Okay. This is really bad because that reduces the surface area inside the alveolus, okay, or inside your alveolar sac. Okay. If you have a reduced surface area, that's going to cause oxygen diffusion across into the pulmonary capillaries to be reduced as well. Okay, and so it's going to be a lot harder to bring oxygen in and get carbon dioxide out of your blood. Okay, and so you end up with a lower blood oxygen level. Okay, so if you have a lower blood oxygen level and your blood is not as oxygenated, okay, that's going to cause you to become more winded, okay, because you're not having as much oxygen getting to your muscles, getting enough oxygen to your tissues and things like that. And so people who are dealing with emphysema typically are very winded very quickly and very easily. whenever they undergo some exercise. And so a lot of times what they'll say is, they'll go, walk up the stairs, and by the time they get to the top of the stairs, they're extremely winded and exhausted. And again, that's going to be due to the fact that they're not able to transport enough oxygen into their blood capillaries because their alveoli have been destroyed. Okay? And so for that reason, people who are dealing with emphysema have to expend a lot of effort in their chest muscles to help them be able to breathe more efficiently. And so they end up developing a condition called barrel chest. Okay? So here, this is what a normal person's chest should look like. But in someone with barrel chest, you can see the muscles around their chest and their abdomen and their back become a lot thicker and a lot more pronounced. Okay? And so the reason for that is because they have to expend more effort to help breathe. Okay? And so their breathing muscles become a lot more used and a lot larger because they have a harder time breathing. Okay? So this is emphysema. Again, this is going to be due to the alveolar walls getting destroyed, and they remain open during exhalation. Okay. Any questions on emphysema? So this is another one I want you to be comfortable with for the exam too. Okay. Any questions on emphysema?
Is that the same as hypoxia, or would that be the same?
So emphysema leads to a version of hypoxia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So you're exactly right. So because you're not able to breathe in and bring in as much oxygen into your body, okay, or into your blood, okay, that's going to be reduced oxygen that gets to your tissues. And so that would give you tissue hypoxia. So emphysema leads into tissue hypoxia. So yeah, you're exactly right there.
Okay.
So good connection, very good connection. Any other questions here?
No.
Okay, cool. All right. So like I said, be comfortable with those two types of COPD, okay, and how they develop. Okay. So there's another condition called pneumonia, which you've all probably heard of as well. And so pneumonia is a type of infection or inflammation specifically of the alveoli. And so this gets caused by a bacteria called Streptococcus pneumoniae. And so when this bacteria tends to enter the lungs, it causes a lot of inflammation and infection inside the lungs. Okay? And so this is typically pretty easy to see under a chest x-ray. And so under normal conditions, you'll see your heart, kind of the outline of your heart, because you have lots of fluid here, so you're going to see a white space. But your lungs should be mostly black because it's just airspace in there. Okay? That's what you normally should see. Okay? But in someone who's dealing with pneumonia, okay, you're going to end up seeing a white space where their lungs are because their lungs have filled with fluid as well. Okay? And so that's what the bacteria causes. Okay? So the bacteria, the Streptococcus pneumoniae, is going to start releasing a bunch of toxins that cause inflammation inside the lungs. Okay? Those toxins cause inflammation inside the alveoli specifically and can actually damage the bronchial membrane as well. And it causes fluid buildup or edema inside the lungs. Okay? And so that's what we see here. Okay? And so in a normal individual, someone who's not dealing with pneumonia, their alveoli should be mostly open, okay, should be just filled with air. So oxygen and carbon dioxide can easily flow from the pulmonary capillaries and into the alveoli and vice versa. Okay. And someone who's dealing with pneumonia, okay, their alveoli are going to be filled with fluid. Okay. And so oxygen and carbon dioxide can't really occupy the same space as fluid. And so you end up with lots of oxygen kind of built up inside this particular part, but it can't diffuse into the capillaries because there's too much fluid in the way. Okay. And so for that reason, it becomes a lot harder for people to oxygenate their blood, okay, because of the fluid buildup inside the alveoli. And so it interferes with your gas exchange. And so as a result, you end up with tissue hypoxia as well. Okay. And so pneumonia can sometimes just be a bacterial issue that just kind of comes up. And the people who are most susceptible to it are people who are either elderly or infants, or people who are immunocompromised, and people who are cigarette smokers. Although it can happen to a few other people as well. But those are the people who are most susceptible to developing pneumonia. Okay. And so to treat it, there's a lot of antibiotics to fight off the bacteria. They'll use bronchodilators to kind of help expand the airways, and then some increased fluid intake to help you kind of flush everything out, and then oxygen therapy too. Okay, so that's pneumonia. Any questions on pneumonia here?
No.
Is it so deadly? I mean, I think I've seen it. It's very dangerous sometimes, pneumonia, right?
Yes. Yeah, so this can be very dangerous, especially if it's not treated very quickly. And so the reason it can be so dangerous is because you're not able to bring that oxygen past this fluid in the alveoli and then into your capillaries. And so if you're not able to take in as much oxygen, that's going to be less oxygen that's able to get to your vital organs. And so if this happens for too long of a period of time, you could actually cause some of the organs to not be as effective. And in some cases, again, if it lasts for a severely long period of time, can cause some of those organs to start to fail because they're not getting enough oxygen. Yeah.
When you say cigarette smokers are more immune to it, would you also consider like other tobacco products, or is it just cigarettes that are really bad? Like say like cigars or like nicotine devices or anything else?
Yeah, so pretty much anything that you can smoke.
Smoke, okay.
Yeah, so pretty much anything that you can smoke, especially anything involving nicotine, really, that you can smoke is going to cause issues here. So cigarettes, cigars, vapes are still kind of, no one really knows just yet because it's still kind of early. But pretty much anything that you can smoke can cause this to take place. Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that one.
Okay.
Yeah. Very good.
So also in elderly, when they lie down for too long periods of time when they're recovering from sickness or illness, this condition develops, and generally I think doctors advise like you should be moving, you should be lying down on your back, let's say for long periods of time. So how does this condition actually develop while you're not moving much? Is it because the fluid's actually getting accumulated over a period of time if you're not moving? Is that how?
Yeah, I think that's what it has to do with. I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head, but I think because you're not moving as much, it makes it easier for that fluid to kind of just build up, especially if you've been exposed to the bacterium.
Right.
And so the more you move, the more it's easier for that fluid to kind of be either exhaled or just kind of be moved throughout the body and exit out of the lungs, essentially. Yeah.
I see.
Good question. Okay. All right. So now moving forward here. So question. So which of the structures listed below is or are parts or components of the respiratory zone of the respiratory system, which is part of the respiratory zone? So we have the alveoli, the bronchi, the larynx, nose, or the trachea.
I think it should be the alveoli.
Right?
Alveoli.
Yes.
Yes. Right. So just the alveoli. Because remember, the respiratory zone is the places where we just have
exchange of gases.
Gases.
Right. And so the only place where we're going to have any exchange of gases is going to be in the alveoli as they exchange gases with the pulmonary capillaries. Perfect. Good. Okay. So when we look at the lungs, there's going to be two sets of arteries and two sets of veins coming from the lungs. Okay. So we've already seen one of them, which are the pulmonary arteries. Okay. So the pulmonary arteries are going to be involved with moving deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle into the lungs to help that blood now become oxygenated. Okay? So that's one type of those pulmonary arteries. Okay? The second type of arteries we're going to see in the lungs are called the bronchial arteries. Okay? The bronchial arteries are specifically there to help supply oxygen and nutrients to the lung tissue. Okay? Kind of similar to the coronary arteries in the heart. Okay? So just like the coronary arteries need the heart itself, the myocardium, needs its own supply of oxygenated blood, okay, in order to kind of continue working. The lungs need the same thing. Okay, so the bronchial arteries are going to be responsible for delivering oxygenated blood to the muscles and to the tissue within the lungs to help the tissue kind of remain functional. Okay. So pulmonary arteries and then the bronchial arteries, which we see over here. Okay. Now there's there's a kind of a term that we use when we're looking at the lungs called patency. Okay, what patency means is the ability of a particular part of your airways to either remain open or remain unobstructed. Okay, and so the openness of our airways kind of refers to our patency. Okay, and so we have patency in different areas of our respiratory system. And so the bony and cartilaginous parts of the nose help to kind of keep the airways open, and so that's going to contribute to some of the patency there. The pharynx it's going to have skeletal muscles that are going to keep it open, so that's going to allow airways to stay open there. We're going to have the larynx, which is going to have some cartilage, and that cartilage is going to be pretty rigid and keep the larynx open as well, so air is going to be able to flow through. The C-shaped rings of the cartilage inside the trachea, okay, that's going to be able to maintain some patency as well. Keep that open. The smooth muscle in the bronchioles maintains patency, and then the surfactant as well inside the alveoli maintains patency as well, because the surfactant is going to keep the alveoli popped open. So patency is going to be really important to make sure that our oxygen is going to be able to flow through our respiratory system. Okay. However, patency can be compromised depending on different circumstances that we've kind of incurred. Okay. So, for example, if there's some kind of crushing injury to the bone or the cartilage inside the nose. So, for example, if we break our nose or we deviate the nasal septum, that can cause some of the airways to kind of close up a little bit, just because there's now bone and cartilage obstructing things. That can reduce patency because now our airways are closed up a little bit. If there's some inflammation of the mucous membranes, like we saw with chronic bronchitis, the airways are going to constrict because you have more mucus accumulating in those spaces. Okay. If the smooth muscles are of the airways are spasming, that's going to cause patency to be reduced, as well as any deficiencies in surfactant as well. Okay. So patency is going to be important to help maintain the obstruction, or maintain the openness of our respiratory system. Okay. Okay. So now we get into respiration. Okay. So we just looked at how air is able to flow, across the atmosphere into our respiratory system, and then eventually into our lungs and across our blood capillaries. Okay. So now we're going to look at the 3 different ways that we can breathe. Okay. Or not 3 different ways, but 3 different types of respiration that we can have. Okay. So respiration is classified as the exchange of air or exchange of gases between the atmosphere, the blood, and then your body cells as well. Okay. So there's 3 types of respiration, okay, kind of 3 steps. The first step is called pulmonary ventilation, and that's just another way called breathing. Okay. And so that's going to be where we're inhaling and exhaling. Okay. Inhaling being, obviously bringing air from the lungs into the atmosphere, from the atmosphere into the lungs, and then exhaling being able to take the air from the lungs and then breathe out into the atmosphere. Okay. So inhaling and exhaling is pulmonary ventilation, or breathing. Okay, just exchanging air from the atmosphere to the air spaces of the lung. Okay. The second type of respiration is called external respiration. Okay. And so external respiration is where we have an exchange of gases between the alveolar air spaces and the pulmonary capillaries. Okay. And so external respiration is going to be where we're going to be exchanging gases between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries. Okay. So during external respiration, we're going to be moving carbon dioxide from the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli, and then moving oxygen from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries. Okay. So blood is going to be gaining oxygen and losing carbon dioxide. Okay. Now, once we have oxygenated blood, okay, that blood is eventually going to reach our normal body tissues, and so that gives us what's called internal respiration. Okay. So internal respiration is where we deliver oxygen to our normal body tissues, like, for example, our muscle tissues, heart tissues, things like that. Okay. Delivering oxygen from the blood into your body tissues. Once your tissues take in that oxygen, they're going to use it up and produce carbon dioxide, and then that carbon dioxide will then re-enter the blood. Okay. So during internal respiration, okay, our blood is going to be losing carbon dioxide and then picking up losing oxygen and then picking up carbon dioxide. Okay. So one thing to keep straight here is that inhalation is not the same thing as internal respiration, and exhalation is not the same thing as external respiration. And this is something that people always mix up on the exam. Okay. Inhalation is just breathing in, exhalation is breathing out. External respiration involves taking oxygen and pulling it from the alveolus into the capillaries and moving carbon dioxide from the capillaries, the pulmonary capillaries, into the alveolus. Internal respiration is where we move oxygen from our blood into our tissues and then take carbon dioxide from the tissues and put it into the blood. Okay. Any questions on these 3 processes here? Okay, again, this is one thing that people always mix up, and so don't let this be you. Okay. Any questions on these three processes? Okay, so that's pulmonary ventilation, external respiration, and internal respiration. Okay, so question here. So which of the following is the site of exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and the air-filled spaces in the lungs? Is the respiratory membrane, systemic capillaries, terminal bronchioles, segmental bronchi, or the visceral pleurum?
Respiratory membrane.
Respiratory membrane.
Right, this would be the respiratory membrane. Perfect. Cool. Okay, next question. So external respiration involves the movement of oxygen in which of the following ways? Alveoli to the pulmonary capillaries, atmosphere to the alveoli, blood in the capillaries to the alveoli, blood in the systemic capillaries to the interstitial fluid to the tissue cells, or tissue cells to the interstitial fluid to the blood in the systemic capillaries. Which one explains the flow of oxygen?
A.
Right, it would be A. So moving oxygen from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries. Right. Perfect. Okay. All right. So this last kind of few topics here is going to be involved with breathing here. And so we're going to look at how we're actually able to breathe. Okay. And so one thing that's going to be important here is that air is going to be flowing along pressure gradients. Okay, so if we kind of think back to chapter 2, when we're looking at the movement of different molecules from point A to point B. Okay, molecules typically want to move from high concentration to low concentration, or low concentration to high concentration. Which one?
From high to low.
So from high to low.
They want to move from high concentration to low concentration.
Yeah.
Right. So if we're moving molecules from high concentration to low concentration, that's typically the way they want to move. Okay.
Yeah.
Air kind of wants to follow the same pathway. The only difference, though, is that air is going to move, instead of going from concentration to concentration, it's going to move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. Okay. So that is going to be important here. So we'll look at how we're actually able to breathe here. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of do this on the board here. Okay. So I'm going to use my handy dandy whiteboard here.
Okay.
That I've got. Okay. I'm going to kind of move this a little bit closer. Okay. So is everyone able to see my whiteboard okay?
Yes.
Okay. So, like we mentioned before, air wants to move. Sorry, this might not be kind of right, a little lower. So air wants to move from high pressure
To low pressure.
to low pressure. Okay. So this is going to be kind of a little bit of a physics lesson here. So when we're looking at pressure, pressure and volume are going to be inversely related. Okay. So when we're looking at pressure, if we increase the volume, we're going to end up decreasing the pressure.
Yes.
Okay. And then when we look at volume, decreasing the volume, that is going to help us increase the pressure. So this is going to be a trend that's going to be important when it comes to allowing airflow throughout the lungs. Okay. So when we're inhaling, okay, inhaling, we need to breathe. Inhaling is going to be the process of breathing in. Okay? And so I'm going to kind of draw out, a makeshift set of lungs here. Okay. So let's just say this is our lungs. Okay, this is our trachea. This is our lungs. And so I'm going to come draw this a little bit bigger here. Okay. Okay. So these are our lungs. Okay. So in order for us to bring air in, okay, we want to bring air into the lungs, okay, we need to establish a pressure gradient. Okay. Sorry, is everyone able to see this okay? Does that make it a little bit better?
That makes it a little better.
Okay. So we need to increase our pressure gradients. Okay. And so before we inhale, the pressure inside the lungs and in the atmosphere is going to be exactly the same. Okay. It's going to be at about 760 millimeters of mercury in the atmosphere as well as inside the lungs. Okay. And so in order to cause air to flow into the lungs, do we need to cause the pressure to decrease in the lungs, or do we need it to increase? Assuming air wants to move from an area of high pressure to low pressure.
Decrease in the lungs.
Decrease.
We need it to decrease, right? So for inhalation, we need the pressure to decrease. Okay. Now, the only way that we can cause the pressure to decrease is to cause is to cause an increase in the volume of the lungs. Okay. So we're going to try to decrease the volume of the lung, and we're going to look at how we're actually able to do that. Okay. And so in order to do so, in order to have an inhalation process actually take place, we need to increase the volume. And so that's going to be due to two different muscles. And we're going to be using the diaphragm, and then we're also going to be using the external intercostal muscles. Okay. So here's the way this is going to work. Sorry, there's a lot of writing, but I'll kind of explain it as we draw it over here. Okay. So I suggest kind of drawing this out on your notes because it kind of helps to make this make a little bit more sense. So the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to take our diaphragm. And so the diaphragm is going to be this region right here, where our lungs are going to be sitting on top of. Okay. And we need the diaphragm to contract. Okay. So when you take a deep breath, your diaphragm contracts. And when it contracts, it flattens out. And so now, instead of your diaphragm being all the way up here, it's going to come right down here. Okay. That's going to increase the volume of your thoracic cavity. Okay. The second thing that's going to happen is the external intercostal muscles, which are these muscles in between your ribs, are going to contract. And as they contract, they cause the ribs to open up. Okay. And so they're going to kind of pull the ribs more superiorly and anteriorly, as well as the sternum. Okay. And so that is going to cause your thoracic cavity to increase in volume as well over here. Okay. Okay. And so now, instead of our lungs being confined to this particular space, as we breathe in, it expands to now accumulate all of this space here. So our thoracic cavity has now increased in volume. And so when it increases in volume, it causes the lungs to be able to pull out. It pulls the parietal pleura out, and then also pulls the lungs with it. And again, that will increase the volume. Okay. When the volume increases inside the thoracic cavity, okay, that reduces the pressure to about 758 or so. Again, don't worry about the numbers, just know it decreases. But it decreased about 758 millimeters of mercury. And now we've created a pressure gradient where we have 760 millimeters of mercury on the outside in the atmosphere and 758 inside the lungs. Okay. So now we've got a pressure gradient that air can now follow through. Okay. And so now air is going to flow from an area of high pressure, the atmosphere here, let's put atmosphere, into the lungs. Okay. And so that's how we inhale. Okay. So again, you cannot inhale until you open up the thoracic cavity. Okay. In order to do so, you need the diaphragm to contract, you need the external intercostal muscles to contract, and that will increase the volume. When you increase the volume, that decreases the pressure, and when the pressure decreases, only then can air flow into the lungs. Okay. Yeah. Does this make sense?
Yes. So the difference between the atmospheric pressure and also the pressure inside the lungs is only 2 millimeters of mercury, right? That's the kind of difference we're talking about?
Yeah, or so, ish.
Okay.
That's the kind of difference we're talking about for just a regular old passive inhalation. Yeah. Okay. So when you're just kind of breathing normally, yeah, it's about 2 millimeters of mercury of the difference there. Yeah. So that's that. Now, when you're doing a more forceful inhalation, okay, so if you kind of imagine like taking a big deep breath, that's going to cause some extra muscles to begin contracting. Okay, And so those extra muscles are going to further increase the size of your thoracic cavity and then further decrease the pressure so you're able to increase your air intake. Okay? So the muscles that are going to be involved during a forceful inhalation are going to be a sternocleidomastoid muscles, which are going to elevate the sternum, the scalene muscles, which are going to elevate the ribs, and then the pectoralis muscles, which are going to elevate the ribs as well. Okay? So when you involve all three of those other muscles, they help to further expand your thoracic cavity and allow you to be able to create a bigger pressure gradient, okay? And then breathe in more air as a result of that.
Mm-hmm. In other words, to become a yogi.
Those are the accessory muscles of inhalation. Yeah, sorry, one more time.
I said, in other words, you become a yogi.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. Those are the muscles you use when you become a yogi. Yeah,
Yogi.
Exactly. Exactly. Any other questions here? Does this make sense?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So again, that's for an inhalation. So the two primary muscles for inhalation are the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. And so that's going to be for just a regular old passive inhalation, okay, also called inspiration. When you're using a more forceful exhalation or inhalation, that's going to be where you use the accessory muscles, okay, the sternocleidomastoid, the scalene, and the pectoralis minor muscles. Okay.
Can you
Now,
repeat?
when we're performing an exhalation, we essentially do the whole process in reverse. Oh yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yes, it's okay. Can you repeat the accessory muscles for more rapid inhalation?
Yeah. So they're a more forceful inhalation. So when you take a really deep breath in, okay, just like that kind of big breath,
Yeah.
that big breath is going to be used, or in order to make that big breath, you're going to be using these accessory muscles.
Okay.
Yeah, the sternocleidomastoid, the scalene, and the pectoralis minor.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So now, when we're performing an exhalation, this is going to be, or also called expiration. This is where you breathe out. Okay? And so breathing out is going to be essentially the reverse of this whole process here. Okay? So if we kind of start over from the beginning, okay? I'm going to kind of just erase and draw this all over again. Okay? If we start this whole process from the beginning, okay, again, here we have our lungs here. Okay. I'll kind of just draw this more flattened here. That's our diaphragm. Okay. Okay. So again, starting with 760 in the atmosphere and 760 inside the lungs. Okay. And so if we want to push air out, okay, what do we need to do to the pressure? Do we need to increase the pressure or decrease the pressure?
Increase the pressure.
Inside the lungs.
Yes.
Right, we need to increase the pressure. Okay. And so the way we're going to increase the pressure is by decreasing the volume of the thoracic cavity. Okay. So what this is going to work is we're essentially going to be using the external intercostal muscles and the diaphragm muscles again. Okay. But instead of having them contract, those muscles are going to relax. Okay. And so when the diaphragm relaxes, it's going to kind of pull itself more superiorly. Okay. And so we have it kind of like this, kind of exaggerating it there. And so it ends up moving more superiorly here. And then the external intercostal muscles are also going to contract, or sort of relax. Okay? And so when they relax, okay, now our thoracic cavity might be something like this. I get kind of exaggerating it just so you guys can see it. But this is now our new thoracic cavity. Okay. And so now we have a decreased volume. And so with a decreased volume, we start to increase our pressure. And let's say now it's at about 762. Okay. Now we have established a pressure gradient. And so now air can flow out of the lungs and into the atmosphere. Okay. Okay, again, moving from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. Okay. Does this make sense? Again, same thing, just in the opposite direction. So instead of having those external intercostal muscles and the diaphragm contracting, they're going to be relaxing. They're going to shorten, or they're going to shrink the thoracic cavity, which increases the pressure, allowing you to exhale. Okay. Any questions here? Okay. So again, same process. And again, remember that expiration or the movement of air can only happen when the pressure changes. Okay? And the pressure can only happen when the volume changes. Okay? So a lot of times people will make the mistake of saying that bringing in air will change the pressure, so you can then inhale, which is not true. Okay, you cannot inhale and then change the pressure. What you need to do is you need to change the pressure before you can inhale or exhale.
So
Okay.
with inhalation, we have accessory muscles involved, and with exhalation, we have the internal intercostal muscles, or is it different? Or
yeah, so the exhalation will have a separate set of accessory muscles. So for example, if you're doing like a forced exhalation, the ones that are going to be involved with the forced exhalation are going to be the abdomen or the abdominal muscles, and then the internal intercostal muscles. So they'll contract. So if you kind of imagine like blowing all the air out you can out of your lungs, like that, you're going to feel your abdomen starting to kind of be involved with that. The internal intercostal muscles are going to contract, and they're going to pull the ribs in as well, even further, as well as having the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles relaxing as well. So different set of accessory muscles, but they're both going to be helping accomplish essentially the same goal in terms of establishing a larger pressure gradient.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions here?
No.
Okay. All right. So that is inhalation and exhalation. That's the process they work. So this is just a diagram that kind of helps to show you the muscles of inhalation that are going to be involved here, and then the muscle of exhalation that are going to be involved on the other side. Cool. And so this kind of diagram on the right kind of shows you how the ribs are going to be acting. And so during inhalation, the ribs are going to kind of expand, kind of like or kind of lift upward, almost like the handle on a bucket. And then when you exhale, the ribs will come downward, kind of like the handle on a bucket too. Okay, so that's it. I'm going to kind of move this backwards now. Okay, so the last kind of major topic I want to talk about is the respiratory center. So I'm going to kind of, actually, give me 1 second. Let me try. All right. So last chunk of topic I want to talk about is the respiratory center. And so this one, I'll tell you which parts of it you need to worry about and which parts you don't. But essentially here, there's a certain region of the brain called the respiratory center. And that's going to be involved with regulating your breathing. Okay? And so this respiratory center is going to be found in 2 areas of the brain. One called the pons, which is where you'd have your pontine respiratory group, and then the medulla, which is where you have the medullary respiratory center. Okay? So both of these 2 areas are going to be involved with regulating your breathing. Okay. Okay. So I want you to kind of write down this slide, and I think this will probably be the last slide you need to write down, unless I tell you otherwise. The brain is going to have a cerebral cortex, and that cerebral cortex is going to control everything that we're able to do consciously. Okay. And so the cerebral cortex allows us to be able to control our breathing, because it's going to have some certain connections with the pons and with the medulla, okay, with the respiratory centers here. Okay. Now these guys are able to operate without the input from the cerebral cortex. But if we want to consciously control or voluntarily control our breathing, the cerebral cortex is going to have some connections to the respiratory center and allow us to be able to kind of take over our breathing. Now, we are able to voluntarily control our breathing, which is important because that's going to help us to protect ourselves from causing too much water to enter our system. For example, if we're swimming, okay, we're going to voluntarily control our breathing and prevent water from coming into our respiratory system and drowning us. And then it's also able to help us protect against any irritating gases. Okay? So if there's any gases in the atmosphere, hey, we're able to kind of stop our breathing, okay, for a little bit to make sure that we don't breathe in any of those bad gases. Okay? And so these can be, gases from anything that kind of work chemically to, gases that your sibling might be kind of producing to kind of make you a little upset. Okay. And so those voluntary, so that's going to be really important for voluntary control. Okay, now here's the thing about voluntarily controlling our breathing. There's only a certain amount of time we're able to voluntarily hold our breath. Okay, so if you ever been, competing with your, a friend or a sibling to see who can like hold their breath underwater the longest, right? You go down under the water, you hold your breath, but there's a certain point where you're kind of forced upward, okay, up to take a breath. Okay, the reason for that is because there's a particular set of neurons inside the medullary respiratory center called the DRG neurons. Okay, don't worry about what they are, but they essentially will monitor your carbon dioxide levels. Okay, so what's going to be happening is when you're underwater and you're not breathing, okay, you're preventing yourself from breathing in oxygen and then breathing out carbon dioxide, but your body is still producing carbon dioxide. So at a certain point, your body can withstand that, but there comes a threshold where it says, okay, there's too much carbon dioxide in here. We're obviously not breathing. We need to take a breath. Otherwise, there's going to be some serious consequences. Okay, so the DRG neurons are going to force you to come up and take a breath of air. Okay, they're going to force you to do everything you can to get oxygen. Okay? And so the way it's going to be doing that is the medullary respiratory center is going to send impulses down to your phrenic nerves and your intercostal nerves, which will stimulate your intercostal muscles and your diaphragm, okay, to force you to start breathing. Okay? And there's going to be a few other mechanisms that are going to be working as well. Okay? So once those carbon dioxide levels rise to a certain point, those neurons are going to activate and force you to take a breath. Okay? Now, the kind of funny kind of thing to that is, if you're ever dealing with kids, and let's say a kid wants a cookie and he's not allowed to have one, he might say, I'm gonna hold my breath and I'm gonna die, and he holds his breath for as long as he can. Okay? Well, you can just let him do that, because eventually, even if he is holding his breath, his carbon dioxide levels are gonna eventually rise to a certain point where his DRG neurons are going to force him to take a breath. Okay? So he's never going to be able to cause himself to suffocate because he's holding his breath, because these neurons are going to jump in, okay, and force him to breathe. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So that's that. And then there's also going to be some extra nerve impulses that come from the hypothalamus and come from the limbic system that can also regulate your emotional responses to breathing as well. Okay. Okay. This is another slide I want you to write down. I think this will be the last slide. Yeah. So this slide has to do with the chemoreceptors. So in order to monitor your carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion levels, you have to have specific receptors that are able to pick up on them. Okay. And so these are going to be your chemoreceptors. And so chemoreceptors are going to be able to pick up on carbon dioxide levels, hydrogen ion levels, and oxygen levels. And then they're going to provide that information to the respiratory center. Okay. From there, the respiratory center will then take that information and decide how it needs to breathe. Do I need to breathe faster? Do I need to breathe slower? Do I need to breathe deeper? Do I need to not breathe as deep? And it's going to be able to regulate your breathing, okay, and your respiratory rate. Okay. So we've got two types of chemoreceptors. The first type of chemoreceptor is called the central chemoreceptors, and these are found inside the medulla oblongata, inside your central nervous system, essentially. Okay. And so these would be your hydrogen ion, your carbon dioxide levels as well. So they're able to pick up on these particular chemicals, okay, inside the brain, okay, inside the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. The second type of chemoreceptors are going to be found inside the aorta and inside the carotid arteries, and these are called the peripheral chemoreceptors. And so these are found in the aorta and the carotid arteries. And again, they're going to be monitoring carbon dioxide, oxygen, and hydrogen ion levels. Okay. Okay, so those are chemoreceptors. Okay, I don't think you don't need to write this slide down. But just here for chemoreceptors, they're going to be able to regulate your breathing. And so the sensory neurons inside the aortic bodies and the carotid bodies are going to be connected to some of your cranial nerves, cranial nerve 9 and 10. Don't worry about it, just know that happens. And so when you start to increase your carbon dioxide levels, that increase in carbon dioxide will stimulate the central and peripheral chemoreceptors, which will then send information to the medullary respiratory center. Okay. When the respiratory center picks up on that increase in carbon dioxide levels, that's going to say, hey, we have too much carbon dioxide here. We need to increase our respiratory rate, okay, breathe a little bit faster, so we can get this carbon dioxide out of our body. Okay. And so that's going to be a way to help kind of protect ourselves from carbon dioxide kind of poisoning here, I guess. Okay. The flip side of that is if we have carbon dioxide levels that are lower than normal, the chemoreceptors don't get stimulated, so they're only going to get stimulated if there's an increase in carbon dioxide. Okay? But if there's not enough carbon dioxide there, those chemoreceptors are not going to get stimulated, and so there's not going to be an increase in respiratory rate. In fact, there's going to be a decrease in respiratory rate until that carbon dioxide comes back to an appropriate level. All right. Exercise can also have an impact here. So exercise is going to increase your cardiac output, like we talked about last week. And so your cardiac output is the amount of blood that you're able to eject with every heartbeat. And so when you pump out more blood from the heart, okay, that's eventually going to lead to more blood leading into the lungs or getting to the lungs. When you have more blood flow go into the lungs, you're going to be able to pick up more oxygen, and then you're able to deliver higher levels of oxygen to the rest of your body. Okay. And so during maximal exercises, you're able to pick up more oxygen from the alveoli at any point in time. Okay. And again, that's going to be due to increases in like aerobic exercise. Okay. Now, when you start beginning exercise, okay, your brain is going to say, hey, we're starting to work out a little bit. We need to start to increase our breathing rate because we're about to do a lot of exertion here. Okay? And so it's going to increase your breathing rate abruptly, and that's going to be due to the neurons in the DRG inside the medullary respiratory center. Okay? Then as you start to undergo more exercise, your breathing rate is going to continue to increase because your muscles are going to be using up more oxygen and producing more carbon dioxide. And so because you have a higher carbon dioxide level, you start to breathe out more and start to increase your respiratory rate to breathe out that carbon dioxide. Then when you stop exercising, your respiratory rate is going to decrease, and as it decreases, that is going to ultimately help you to kind of get all your levels back to normal. Okay. All right, and that's it for the respiratory system. So